The day Sheriff Marcus Dugan dumped his paralyzed daughter on Luke Callahan's doorstep like unwanted cargo, he thought he was ridding himself of shame. What he didn't know was that he'd just handed his greatest weakness to a man who'd learned to see worth where others saw ruin. This is the story of how an abandoned woman and a broken rancher built an empire from dust and defiance. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Part 1: The Cruel Gift. The Arizona Territory in 1873 was a land that forgave nothing and no one. It was a place where the sun didn't just shine, it punished beating down on red dirt and scrub brush with the kind of relentless fury that separated the survivors from the dreamers. Luke Callahan had long since stopped dreaming. His ranch sat 15 miles outside of Redemption, a town that had earned its name from the number of men who'd come there seeking second chances and found only hard living and harder choices. The Callahan spread wasn't much to look at: 200 acres of stubborn land, a cabin that leaked when the rare rains came, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, as if trying to escape the prevailing wind, and a corral that held 3 horses and a mule with a mean streak. But it was his, paid for with war wages and watered with sweat and blood. Luke had been working since dawn that particular Thursday mending fence line along the eastern boundary where coyotes had been testing his defenses. At 42, he was lean and weathered, his face carved by sun and grief into something harder than the land itself. His left shoulder carried a Minié ball that hadn't quite killed him at Chancellorsville, and his right hand bore scars from a fire that had taken everything he'd loved 10 years prior. He didn't talk much anymore. Didn't see the point. The sound of wagon wheels crunching over the Caliche Road made him look up from his work. Visitors were rare out here and rarely good news. Luke straightened slowly, his hand instinctively checking the colt at his hip, a habit from his cavalry days that had never left him. The wagon that crested the rise was expensive, pulled by a matched pair of bays that cost more than most men in the territory made in a year. Luke recognized it immediately. Sheriff Marcus Dugan's personal rig, polished and pretentious, as out of place in this hard-scrabble country as a diamond in a pig pen. Luke's jaw tightened. He'd had dealings with Dugan before, none of them pleasant. The sheriff was a political creature, one of those men who'd come west not for freedom, but for power, buying his badge through connections back east, and maintaining it through a combination of charm for the wealthy and cruelty for everyone else. The wagon pulled up 20 yards from where Luke stood, dust settling around it like a dirty halo. Sheriff Dugan sat in the driver's seat, his considerable bulk straining against a vest that had probably been tailored in San Francisco. His face was florid, whether from the heat or whiskey Luke couldn't tell, and his smile had all the warmth of a snake eyeing a mouse. "Callahan!" Dugan's voice boomed across the space between them, jovial in that forced way politicians had. "Fine afternoon, isn't it?" Luke said nothing. Just waited. He'd learned long ago that silence made most men uncomfortable enough to show their hand. Dugan's smile flickered slightly, but he pressed on. "I've come with a proposition for you, a business opportunity, you might say." "Not interested in business with you, Sheriff." Luke's voice was quiet, but it carried. He'd learned to project during the war when making yourself heard over cannon fire might be the difference between life and death for your men. "Now don't be hasty." Dugan shifted on the seat, and for the first time Luke noticed movement in the back of the wagon. "You're out here all alone working this land by yourself. That's got to be hard on a man. What you need is help. What you need," he paused dramatically, "is a wife." Luke's eyes narrowed. "I had a wife, Sheriff. She's dead. Not looking for another." "Well, that's where you're wrong, friend." Dugan's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Every man needs a woman around the place. For cooking, cleaning, all those domestic duties that keep a household running smooth. And I've got just the solution for you." He stood then, moving to the back of the wagon, and Luke felt his stomach turn as understanding began to dawn. When Dugan pulled back the canvas cover, Luke saw her. A woman sat in the wagon bed, positioned in a wheeled chair that had been lashed down to keep it from rolling. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled back severely from a face that would have been beautiful if it weren't set in such careful blankness. She wore a dress that had once been fine, but now showed the wear of someone who'd been living rough. Her hands were folded in her lap with deliberate precision, and her eyes gray as winter storm clouds stared straight ahead, refusing to look at either man. But it was her legs that made Luke's chest tighten. They lay motionless beneath her skirts, positioned carefully artificially, paralyzed. "This here is my daughter Abigail," Dugan announced, his tone somewhere between a horse trader and an auctioneer. "She had herself an accident about 6 months back. Fell off a horse, broke her back. Doctors say she'll never walk again." He said it with the casual dismissiveness of a man discussing broken furniture. "She can't do much, truth be told, but she's got working hands and a functioning brain. Could probably help with light chores, keep house for you." Luke's gaze moved from the sheriff to the woman Abigail. She still hadn't looked at either of them, but he saw the muscle jump in her jaw, the way her knuckles whitened as her hands clenched. This wasn't just humiliation for her. This was practiced endurance. "You're trying to give me your daughter," Luke said slowly, making sure he understood the depths of what he was witnessing. "Give is such a charitable word." Dugan laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Let's say I'm offering you a mutually beneficial arrangement. You get household help, I get—" He paused, his eyes going cold despite the smile still plastered on his face. "I get one less mouth to feed, one less burden dragging down my household and my reputation." The words hung in the air like the stench of something dead. Luke had seen a lot in his 42 years, had watched men die screaming in Virginia. Mud had pulled his wife and infant son from a burning cabin too late to save them, had killed men and watched them kill each other over land and water and gold. But this casual cruelty toward one's own blood made his stomach turn in a way that violence never had. "She's your daughter," Luke repeated, his voice flat. "She's useless." Dugan's jovial mask slipped entirely now, replaced by cold calculation. "Can't walk, can't dance, can't do any of the things that would make her marriageable to a proper gentleman. My wife, God rest her, passed 2 years ago, and without a woman to care for her, Abigail's become nothing but a drain on my resources and an embarrassment at social functions. People whisper when they see her. It reflects poorly on me." "So you're dumping her on a stranger?" "I'm offering her to you as a housekeeper," Dugan corrected, his tone sharpening. "And before you go getting all righteous on me, Callahan, remember who you are. You're a broke-down ex-soldier living on a patch of dirt that barely qualifies as a ranch. You got no wife, no prospects, and from what I hear, you can barely keep this place running on your own. I'm doing you a favor." Luke's hand flexed near his gun, but he kept his voice level. "And if I say no," Dugan shrugged, "then I suppose I'll have to make other arrangements. There's a territorial asylum up in Prescott that takes in cripples and defectives. I'm sure they'd find a bed for her eventually, though. From what I hear, those places aren't particularly comfortable." The threat was delivered with a smile. For the first time, Luke allowed himself to really look at Abigail Dugan. She sat rigid in her chair, her face still carefully blank, but he could see the tremor in her shoulders now. Not fear, or not just fear. Rage. A deep burning fury that she was keeping locked down through sheer force of will. Their eyes met for just a second, and in that moment Luke saw something that made his decision for him. He saw the same look he'd had 10 years ago when he'd crawled from the burning ruins of his cabin, knowing everything was lost but refusing to quit anyway. It was the look of someone who'd been beaten down, but not beaten. Someone who was still fighting even if no one else could see the battle. "I'll take her," Luke heard himself say. Dugan blinked, surprised that it had been so easy. "You will—" "I'll take her," Luke repeated. "But not as a favor to you, Sheriff. Don't ever think that." Something flickered across Dugan's face. Relief, certainly, but also a flash of something that might have been shame if the man had been capable of such an emotion. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his politician's smile. "Excellent. I knew you were a reasonable man, Callahan." He was already moving to untie the chair from the wagon bed, working with the hasty efficiency of a man eager to be done with an unpleasant task. "She's got a trunk of clothes and personal items here. Not much, but probably more than she needs. She can read and write, knows basic arithmetic. Her hands work fine for light tasks." He was talking about her like she was livestock, and Luke felt his anger building. But he kept quiet, moving to help maneuver the wheeled chair from the wagon to the ground. It was heavier than it looked, solidly built, probably custom-made before Dugan had decided his daughter was more burden than blessing. Abigail didn't make a sound during the transfer, didn't offer help or resistance. She simply sat there, hands folded, eyes forward, enduring. Luke wondered how many times she'd been moved around like a piece of furniture since her accident. When the chair was safely on the ground and the trunk unloaded beside it, Dugan brushed his hands together with the air of a man completing a satisfactory business transaction. "Well then, I'll leave you two to get acquainted. Abigail, you mind your manners and do as Mr. Callahan tells you. He's your employer now." He climbed back into his wagon, taking up the reins. Then he paused, looking down at Luke with an expression that was almost sympathetic. "Fair warning, Callahan, she doesn't talk much. Hasn't said more than a handful of words since the accident. Don't expect sparkling conversation." Luke didn't respond, just stood there with his hand resting on the handle of Abigail's chair waiting for the sheriff to leave. Dugan took the hint, snapping the reins and turning his expensive rig back toward town. Luke and Abigail watched him go, neither of them speaking until the wagon was just a dust trail on the horizon. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Luke became acutely aware that he'd just accepted responsibility for another human being without any real plan for what came next. He cleared his throat. "I imagine you're thirsty," he said quietly. "It's hot as hell out here, and that ride from town isn't short." Abigail didn't respond, didn't even look at him, just kept staring at the space where her father's wagon had disappeared. Luke tried again. "My cabin's not fancy, but it's cool inside. Stone walls keep out the worst of the heat. I've got fresh water from the well, and I made bread yesterday that's still good." Nothing. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement. Luke felt awkward in a way he hadn't since his courting days 30 years ago. He wasn't a man comfortable with words at the best of times, and this strange, silent woman in her wheeled chair presented a challenge he had no experience with. "Right then," he said finally. "Let's get you inside." He moved around to face her, crouching down so they were at eye level. This close he could see details he'd missed before: the fine bones of her face, the slight sunburn on her nose that suggested she hadn't been outdoors much recently, the calluses on her palms that told him she'd been working despite her father's dismissal of her capabilities. And her eyes. Now that they met his, directly held such a storm of emotion that it took his breath away. Anger, yes. Fear, certainly. But also something else. Something that looked like desperate dying hope. "My name's Luke Callahan," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "I know your father said I'm your employer, but that's not how I see it. You're a guest in my home until we figure out something better. I'm going to lift you now, if that's all right, just to get you inside where it's more comfortable. I'll come back for the chair." He waited, giving her the chance to protest or pull away. She did neither, just kept looking at him with those storm cloud eyes. Luke took that as permission and slid his arms carefully beneath her knees and behind her back. She was lighter than he'd expected, almost fragile despite the core of steel he sensed beneath her stillness. As he lifted her, she made a small sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sigh. Her arms came up instinctively to circle his neck, and he felt her trembling. Not from fear, he realized, but from the sheer overwhelming nature of what was happening. Her entire life had just been upended, and she was being carried by a stranger to an unknown future. "I've got you," Luke said quietly. "You're safe. I promise you that." He felt more than heard her sharp intake of breath at those words. Safe. It was probably a concept she'd forgotten existed. The walk to the cabin was short, maybe 30 yards, but Luke felt every step of it. He was hyper-aware of the woman in his arms, of her carefully controlled breathing, of the way she held herself rigid, as if afraid to relax even slightly. By the time he reached the door, his shoulder was aching from the old wound, but he didn't let it show. The cabin was indeed cooler inside the thick adobe walls doing their job. It was a simple space, one main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and in the corner, Luke's bed. There was a door leading to a smaller back room that he used mostly for storage. Luke carried Abigail to one of the chairs at the table and gently set her down. Her arms lingered around his neck for just a moment before she pulled them back, folding her hands in her lap in that careful, practiced way she had. He stepped back, giving her space, and found himself at a loss for what to do next. I'll get your chair," he said, finally moving back toward the door. "And your trunk." He made 3 trips: first the wheeled chair, which he positioned near the table, then the trunk, which was heavier than he'd expected, and finally a return to the well for a bucket of fresh water. By the time he was done, the afternoon sun was slanting through the western window, and Luke realized he had no idea what to do about sleeping arrangements. The thought made him uncomfortable in a way he hadn't anticipated. He'd been alone for a decade, his cabin, his private domain, and now there was a woman here silent and watchful, upending his careful solitude. He poured water into a tin cup and set it on the table within her reach, along with a plate containing thick slices of bread and some dried beef. "You should eat something," he said. "I'm going to finish up my work outside before dark. Will you be all right here for a bit?" For the first time since her father had left, Abigail moved. She reached for the cup with hands that trembled slightly, raised it to her lips, and drank. Not daintily the way Luke imagined society ladies drank, but in deep, desperate swallows, like someone who'd been denied water for too long. When she lowered the cup, she finally spoke. "Thank you." Her voice was rough from disuse, barely more than a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound Luke had heard in years, simply because it meant she was still in there, still fighting to exist despite everything that had been done to her. "You're welcome," he managed, and fled outside before he could do something foolish, like promise her things he had no right to promise. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange fog. Luke worked mechanically, finishing the fence repairs, checking on the horses, doing all the routine tasks that made up his days. But his mind was back in that cabin, wrestling with the reality of what he'd just done. He'd taken in Marcus Dugan's daughter, a paralyzed woman with no prospects and, from what he could see, no hope. A woman who'd been discarded by her own father like broken furniture. And Luke had no earthly idea what he was supposed to do about it. He wasn't a caretaker, wasn't a nursemaid or a doctor. He was just a broken-down ex-soldier trying to scratch out a living on land that didn't want to give him anything. What could he possibly offer someone like Abigail? But when he returned to the cabin, as twilight painted the sky purple and gold, he found her where he'd left her, sitting at his table with her hands folded and her eyes distant. The bread and meat were untouched, and Luke realized she probably hadn't eaten all day. "You need to eat," he said, trying to keep his voice gentle but firm. "I'm not hungry." Her voice was still barely audible. "Doesn't matter. You need strength." He moved to the stove, stoking the fire that had burned down to coals. "I'll make soup, something easier." "You don't have to." Finally, she looked at him. "You don't have to do any of this. I know why you took me. You felt sorry for me. Or maybe you felt guilty letting my father take me to the asylum. But you don't owe me anything, Mr. Callahan. You can take me to town tomorrow, leave me at the church. They'll find somewhere to put me." The resignation in her voice gutted him. This was a woman who'd given up on being wanted, on mattering to anyone, who'd learned to expect nothing so disappointment couldn't touch her anymore. Luke turned from the stove to face her fully. "Your father said you had an accident, fell from a horse." Her jaw tightened. "That's the story he tells." "But it's not true." She was silent for a long moment, weighing whether this stranger deserved her trust. "I didn't fall," she said finally. "I jumped." The words fell between them like stones into still water, rippling outward with implications Luke was only beginning to understand. She hadn't been injured by accident. She'd thrown herself from a moving horse, and the only reason someone did that was if they were running from something worse than a broken back. "From what?" he asked quietly. "From him." Her voice hardened, the first real emotion he'd heard from her. From his plans. From the future he'd arranged without asking me. From a life that wasn't mine. Well, Luke absorbed the pieces clicking together. Marcus Dugan, for all his wealth and position, was known to be a controlling man, one who saw people as tools to advance his own agenda. Luke could imagine what plans a man like that might have for a daughter, plans that treated her as property to be traded for political alliance or social advancement. And Abigail had chosen permanent injury over that future. "Jesus," Luke breathed. He told everyone it was an accident because the truth made him look bad, made him look like he couldn't control his own household. She laughed a bitter sound. "And then when I survived but couldn't walk, I became a different kind of embarrassment, the damaged daughter, the cripple he had to hide away at social functions. So he's been looking for a way to be rid of me that wouldn't reflect poorly on his reputation. And you, Mr. Callahan, you were convenient." Luke moved to the chair across from her and sat down heavily. "I'm sorry." "For what? You didn't break my back." You didn't spend 6 months looking at me like I was already dead. You didn't put me in a wagon like livestock and give me away to the first man who'd take me." Her voice cracked on the last words, and she looked away quickly. "You don't have anything to be sorry for. You're probably the only person in the territory who doesn't." They sat in silence while the last light faded from the sky and darkness filled the cabin. Finally, Luke rose and lit the oil lamp on the table, golden light pushing back the shadows. In its glow, Abigail looked younger, more vulnerable, and Luke felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a familiar yoke. "I can't walk," she said suddenly, as if the confession had been building. "I'll never walk again. I can't do most of the things your father suggested I could do. I can't keep a proper house or cook over a fire or haul water or any of the 100 other things that need doing on a ranch. I can use my hands for light work, but even that tires me. I'm not—" She swallowed hard. "I'm not useful." He was right about that much. "You'll realize it soon enough, and then you'll want to be rid of me too." Luke listened to this catalog of perceived failures and felt something shift in his chest. This woman, who'd been brave enough or desperate enough to break her own body rather than surrender her autonomy, had been convinced she had no value, had internalized her father's cruelty until she believed it herself. "Miss Dugan," he said carefully. "Abigail, I'm going to tell you something and I need you to hear it. Your worth as a human being isn't measured by what you can do for me or anyone else. You're not livestock, you're not furniture, you're a person, and that alone makes you valuable." She stared at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. "I don't know what's going to happen here," Luke continued. "I don't know if you'll stay a week or a year or the rest of your life. But while you're under my roof, you're safe, you're fed, and you're treated with the respect every person deserves. That's not charity or pity. That's just how things are going to be." "Understood." Abigail's lips trembled, and for a moment Luke thought she might cry. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded once, sharp and decisive, and reached for the bread. She ate mechanically without enjoyment, but she ate, and Luke counted that as a victory. Later, as full darkness settled over the ranch, Luke fashioned a makeshift bed for himself in the storage room, giving Abigail his bed in the main cabin. She protested, of course, but he'd been sleeping on harder surfaces than a blanket-covered floor for most of his adult life. Besides, moving her to the bed would be easier than trying to get her comfortable in the back room. He carried her one more time that night, lifting her from the chair to the bed with the same careful gentleness he'd shown earlier. As he pulled the blanket over her, she caught his wrist with surprising strength. "Why?" She asked the question she'd been holding back all day, finally escaping. "Why did you really say yes? Men don't just take in broken women out of goodness. What do you want from me?" Luke looked at her hand on his wrist, at the calluses that matched his own, at the desperate need for truth in her eyes. 10 years ago, he said slowly, I lost my wife and son in a fire. I tried to save them, but I couldn't. I was too late. After that, I spent a long time not caring whether I lived or died, just going through the motions of existence. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Today, when your father was talking about you, like you were already gone, like you didn't matter, I saw something in your eyes. You were still fighting, still refusing to quit, even though everyone around you had given up on you. That takes more courage than anything I did in the war. And I thought, he trailed off, surprised by his own honesty. I thought maybe if I could help you, it might mean something, might matter. Does that make sense? Abigail's grip on his wrist loosened, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. You're a strange man, Luke Callahan. So I've been told. He managed a small smile. Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to make this work. He retreated to his makeshift bed, but sleep was a long time coming. Through the door, he could hear the small sounds of Abigail settling in the creak of the bed frame, the rustle of blankets, and once, so quiet he almost missed it, the sound of muffled crying. Luke lay in the darkness and wondered what the hell he'd gotten himself into. But despite the uncertainty, despite the overwhelming challenge of the situation, he found he didn't regret his decision. Marcus Dugan had meant to dump his unwanted daughter on Luke as a burden, but instead he'd given Luke something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. A reason to try again. Outside, the desert night settled over the Callahan ranch, coyotes calling to each other under a canopy of stars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new awkwardness, new figuring out, But tonight, for the first time in a decade, Luke Callahan's cabin held more than just one broken soul trying to survive. It held two. And sometimes that was enough to start building something new from the ruins of what had been lost. Retreat PQ Part 2. Lưu ý viết 600 chi tật 6,000 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hồi thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết, lần mạn kết thúc, phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhây sang document Part 2, The Silent Kindness. The first morning light came harsh and unforgiving through the cabin window. Waking Luke before the rooster had a chance to crow. For a disoriented moment, he forgot where he was. The storage room floor was harder than he'd remembered, and his back protested as he sat up. Then memory flooded back. Abigail, the sheriff, the choice he'd made without fully thinking through the consequences. He rose quietly, pulling on his boots and running a hand through his hair. Through the door, he could hear nothing from the main room, and he wondered if she was still asleep, or simply lying there in silence, waiting for whatever came next. The uncertainty made his stomach knot. When he eased the door open, he found her awake, sitting upright in his bed with her hands folded in her lap in that precise way she had. She'd managed to braid her hair herself, though it hung crooked over one shoulder, and she was still wearing yesterday's dress. Her eyes tracked him as he entered, wary as a wild animal assessing a threat. "Morning." Luke said, his voice rougher than intended. He cleared his throat. "Did you sleep?" "Some." Her voice was stronger today, less of a whisper. "You didn't have to give me your bed. Had to give you something. Couldn't leave you in the chair all night." He moved to the stove, needing something to do with his hands. "You want coffee? I make it strong, but I can water it down if you prefer." "However you make it is fine." Luke worked in silence, stoking the fire, filling the pot with water from the bucket, measuring out precious coffee grounds. The routine task steadied him, gave him something to focus on, besides the strange woman in his bed and the massive question of what happened next. He could feel her watching him, and it made him self-conscious in a way he hadn't been in years. "Mr. Callahan," she said finally, "we need to discuss practicalities." He glanced over his shoulder. Such as the fact that I can't get out of this bed by myself." Her cheeks flushed, but her voice remained steady. "I need help for everything. Getting dressed, using the facilities, all of it. And I understand if that's more than you bargained for." Luke turned fully to face her, the coffee forgotten. He'd been so focused on the grand gesture of taking her in that he hadn't thought through the intimate realities of caring for someone who couldn't walk. The flush in her cheeks had spread to her neck, and he realized this admission cost her something: pride. Maybe, or the last shreds of dignity her father hadn't already stripped away. "I reckon we'll figure it out," he said carefully. "I'm not going to pretend I know what I'm doing, Miss Dugan. But I've dealt with wounded men before, soldiers who'd lost legs or couldn't move right after taking a bullet. It's not the same, I know, but the principle holds. We'll take it one step at a time." "One step." She laughed, a sharp sound without humor. "Poor choice of words." "Abigail." He waited until she met his eyes. "I'm going to help you because you need help, and I'm the only one here to give it. That's all there is to it. No shame in it for either of us." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her because she nodded once. "All right then. Let's start with the most pressing issue. I need to use the outhouse." The next hour tested Luke's resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. Getting Abigail from the bed to her wheeled chair required a coordination they didn't have yet. He lifted too quickly the first time, jarring her, and she gasped in pain. The second attempt went smoother, but by the time he'd gotten her situated and pushed the chair across the uneven cabin floor, they were both breathing hard. The real challenge came at the doorway. The chair was too wide by 3 inches. Luke stared at the gap between the chair and the doorframe, feeling like an idiot. He'd carried her inside yesterday, but he hadn't thought about the chair needing to fit through. And the cabin had exactly 2 doors, the front and the one to the storage room, which was even narrower. "I can widen the frame," he said, thinking out loud. Take off the trim, maybe shave down the jam. It'll take a few hours, but... Mr. Callahan, Abigail's voice was tired. I appreciate the thought, but I need to go now, not in a few hours. Right, of course. Luke felt heat creep up his neck. I'll carry you then. Chair can wait here. He lifted her again, and this time she didn't tense quite as much in his arms. Progress, he supposed. The walk to the outhouse behind the cabin was awkward. He could feel her humiliation radiating off her in waves, and his own discomfort made him move too stiffly. When they reached the small wooden structure, he hesitated. I can hold myself up, she said quietly. If you can position me right, I'll call when I'm done. It took some maneuvering, but they managed. Luke retreated a respectful distance, staring hard at the horizon while he waited, trying not to think about how this was going to be their reality every single day. When she called, her voice was small, and when he carried her back toward the cabin, she wouldn't meet his eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. For what? For being a burden, for needing so much, for... Stop! Luke's voice came out harder than he intended. He stopped walking, holding her there in the morning sunlight. You're not a burden. You're a person dealing with a difficult situation. There's a difference. Is there... Her gray eyes finally met his, and he saw the shame there, deep and corrosive. Because from where I'm sitting, I'm exactly what my father said I was. Useless. Unable to do even the most basic things for myself. Luke thought about his response carefully. In the war, he said slowly, I saw men lose limbs, lose their sight, lose all kinds of abilities they'd taken for granted. Some of them gave up, just laid down and died, even though their wounds weren't fatal. But others fought like hell to figure out new ways to do things. They couldn't do everything the way they used to, but they found different ways. You strike me as the fighting type, Miss Dugan. So maybe instead of focusing on what you can't do, we figure out what you can. She was quiet for so long he thought he'd offended her. Then, barely audible, she said, No one's ever put it that way before. Well, maybe they should have. Back inside the cabin, Luke set her in the chair by the table and poured coffee for them both. The pot had boiled while they were outside, and the bitter smell filled the small space. He'd meant what he told her, but now the reality of it settled on his shoulders. How was he supposed to run a ranch and care for someone who needed help with everything? The math didn't work. Unless they figured out a different way to do the math. Can you reach the stove from the chair? He asked suddenly. Abigail looked surprised by the question. I don't know. I've never tried. Let's find out. He pushed her chair closer to the cast-iron stove. The wheels caught on the uneven floorboards, and he made a mental note to plane them down. When the chair was positioned, he saw that the stovetop was roughly level with her shoulders. Can you reach the pot? She stretched cautiously, her fingers brushing the handle of the coffee pot. Barely, but I don't have the leverage to lift it. What if I put a lower surface here? Luke crouched down, visualizing. A work table at chair height. You could prepare food there, slide pots onto the stove instead of lifting them. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would work. For the first time since he'd met her, something like interest sparked in Abigail's eyes. You'd really do that? Going to need to do a lot of modifications around here if this arrangement is going to last more than a day or two. He stood brushing off his hands. Door frames need widening, probably need to build a ramp for the front step. That outhouse situation needs a better solution, maybe a chamber pot system in the cabin, something with privacy. He was thinking out loud now, his mind already working through carpentry problems. He'd always been good with his hands, had built most of the ranch's structures himself. This was just another challenge to solve. Abigail watched him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You're serious about this? About letting me stay? I don't say things I don't mean. Luke met her gaze. I told you last night while you're under my roof, you're taken care of. That means making the roof work for you, not just expecting you to suffer through it. She looked down at her hands, blinking rapidly. When she spoke, her voice was thick. I don't understand you. That makes two of us. I don't usually take in stray people. He managed a small smile. But here we are, so we might as well make the best of it. They drank their coffee in companionable silence, and Luke found himself studying her when she wasn't looking. In daylight, without the shadow of her father's cruelty hanging over her, Abigail Dugan was striking. Not beautiful in the delicate way society celebrated, but handsome in a way that suggested strength. Her jaw was firm, her shoulders straight despite everything, and her hands, when they weren't folded in practiced stillness, moved with capable precision. She caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. "Something on your mind, Mr. Callahan?" "Luke," he corrected. "If we're going to be living under the same roof, might as well use first names. And I was thinking you'll need clothes you can manage yourself. That dress looks like it needs 10 buttons and ties you can't reach." Abigail glanced down at herself. "It does. Most of my dresses do. They were made before—" She gestured vaguely at her legs. "Before this. My father never saw the point in getting new ones made since I wasn't going to be attending social functions anymore. We'll figure something out. Maybe modify what you have or make new ones simpler. I'm not much of a seamstress, but I can manage basic work." "You don't have to, Abigail," he interrupted her gently. "Yes, I do. Because otherwise, you'll be dependent on me for even getting dressed, and I suspect you'd hate that even more than you hate the rest of this situation." "Wait." She stared at him, then let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "You're right, I would hate it. I've been dressing myself since I was 4 years old, and having someone else do it makes me feel like a child." "Then we'll make sure you can keep doing it yourself." Luke stood draining the last of his coffee. "But first I need to get some work done outside. The horses need tending, and I've got irrigation ditches to check. Will you be all right here for a few hours?" Uncertainty flickered across her face. "What should I do?" "Whatever you want. Rest if you're tired. Look through your trunk if you want to sort your things. There's books on that shelf if you're inclined to read." He paused. "Or you could come outside with me. Might be nice to get some air." "Outside?" She said it like he'd suggested flying to the moon. "Sure, I'll bring the chair. Ground's rough in places, but most of the yard is packed earth. You could sit in the shade of the barn, keep me company while I work." Abigail looked toward the door, then back at Luke. "I haven't been outside, not just being moved from one building to another since before my accident. My father said there was no point, that I couldn't do anything useful, so why bother?" The casual cruelty of it made Luke's jaw tighten. "Well, your father was wrong about a lot of things. Come on, let's get you some fresh air." Getting the wheeled chair through the doorway required Luke to lift both Abigail and the chair separately, but he managed. Outside, the morning sun was already hot, promising another scorching day, but the shade of the barn offered relief. Luke positioned the chair where Abigail could watch him work, and then set about his chores. At first she sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, watching him with that wary stillness she wore like armor. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, Luke saw her begin to relax. Her shoulders lowered, her hands unclenched. She tilted her face toward the breeze that occasionally stirred the hot air, and something in her expression softened. "It smells different than I remember," she said suddenly. "The desert? Sage and dust and something almost sweet." "Creosote," Luke said, mucking out a stall. "When it rains, the smell gets even stronger. Most beautiful scent in the world to my thinking." "When was the last time it rained here?" 3 weeks ago. Brief storm barely wet the ground, but enough to settle the dust." He paused in his work, leaning on the pitchfork. "You really haven't been outside in 6 months." "My father kept me in my room mostly, said it was for my own good that I needed to rest and recover. But I think he just didn't want to look at me. Didn't want to be reminded that his daughter wasn't perfect anymore." Luke heard the bitterness beneath her words and chose his next question carefully. "What was it like before the accident? Before the pasi sa jumkoat?" Abigail was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then slowly she began to talk. About a life of social obligations and careful appearances of being groomed from childhood to make an advantageous marriage that would elevate her father's political standing. About feeling like a prize horse being trained for auction, valued only for bloodlines and appearance. "He had it all arranged," she said, her voice distant. "A marriage to the territorial governor's son, twice my age with a reputation for cruelty to his servants, but wealthy and connected. My father saw it as the crowning achievement of his political career. I saw it as a cage that would destroy me." "So you jumped from a horse?" "So I jumped from a horse." She met his eyes. "I was riding in the hills outside town, trying to clear my head before the engagement was announced. And I just Couldn't do it. Couldn't go back to that house, to that life, to that future. So when the horse was galloping full speed, I threw myself off. I thought, she swallowed hard. I thought maybe I'd die. That seemed preferable to the alternative. Luke felt the words hit him like a physical blow. This woman had chosen possible death over the life her father had planned for her. And she'd survived, but in a way that made her worthless to Marcus Dugan's ambitions. No wonder he'd been so eager to be rid of her. I'm sorry, Luke said, knowing the words were inadequate. I'm sorry that was your choice. Don't be. I'm not. Abigail's chin lifted. I'd rather be paralyzed and free than walking and caged. At least this way my life is my own, even if it's not much of a life. It could be more than you think. Luke went back to his work, but his mind was racing. You said you can use your hands. Can you sort things? Write do detail work. Yes, why? Because I'm terrible at keeping the ranch books. Haven't balanced an account properly in years. And I've got seed catalogs that need organizing equipment, that needs inventorying, all kinds of paperwork I've been putting off because I hate it. He glanced at her. If you wanted to help with that, it would actually be useful. Not make work to make you feel better, but genuine help. Abigail stared at him. You'd trust me with your accounts. Why wouldn't I? Because you barely know me. Because I'm... She gestured at herself. Like this. Because nothing. You said you can read and write and do arithmetic. That makes you more qualified than me for paperwork. Luke set down the pitchfork. Look, I'm not good at pretty words or knowing the right thing to say, but I meant what I told you. While you're here, you're not just existing. You're living, and that means contributing in ways that make sense for who you are and what you can do. Understand? She nodded slowly, something like wonder crossing her face. No one's ever... My father always said, your father was a fool. Luke said it flatly, without anger. And the sooner you stop measuring yourself by his standards, the better off you'll be. They worked in companionable silence after that, Luke tending the horses and checking equipment, Abigail watching and occasionally asking questions about the ranch. He found himself explaining things he'd never bothered to put into words before, how he rotated the horses through different pastures, why he'd chosen to plant mesquite for shade instead of cottonwood, how the irrigation system worked when there was enough water to use it. And Abigail listened with an attention that suggested genuine interest, not just politeness. She asked good questions, too. Questions that showed she was thinking beyond the surface level. By the time the sun was directly overhead and the heat forced them back inside, Luke realized he'd enjoyed her company. It had been a long time since he'd had someone to talk to who wasn't trying to sell him something or ask him for something. Over the next few days, they fell into a rhythm. Luke would wake early, help Abigail with her morning needs, a process that became slightly less awkward each time, and then they'd have coffee together before he went to work. Some mornings she stayed inside, some she came out to sit in the shade. Either way, they'd reconvene for the midday meal, and Abigail would spend the afternoon working on the ranch paperwork while Luke continued his chores. The books were worse than Luke had thought. Years of hasty notations, missing receipts, and calculations done in his head and never written down had left his accounts in chaos. Abigail attacked the mess with surprising vigor, her capable hands sorting papers into piles, her neat handwriting filling page after page as she reconstructed his finances. You're operating at a loss, she announced on the third day, looking up from the ledger with a frown. Luke, who was building a lower work table for the kitchen area, didn't look surprised. I know. You know, then why? Because knowing and being able to fix it are different things. I make enough to keep food on the table and buy what I need. That's sufficient. But you could do better. Abigail wheeled closer, the ledger balanced on her lap. You're undercharging for your horses. I looked up the market prices in town. You're selling for at least 20% less than you could get. People around here don't have much money. Some don't. But Mr. Harrison, who bought that mare last month, he owns half the mining operation in Silver Creek. He can afford fair price. Luke set down his hammer, interested despite himself. Fair price, huh? Fair price. And you're not tracking your expenses properly, so you don't even know where your money's going. Look here. She pointed at a page. You bought feed 3 times last month, but you didn't note quantities or compare prices. Thompson's feed is charging you more per pound than Martinez's store, and you didn't realize it. He moved to look over her shoulder and found himself impressed by the neat columns and careful calculations. You did all this in 3 days. I had time and your records such as they were. She glanced up at him. I also found that you're donating horses to the church for widows and families in need. You didn't record those transactions at all. Luke shifted uncomfortably. Didn't seem necessary. Wasn't making money on them anyway. Maybe not, but they have value. And if you're going to survive out here, you need to know what you're giving away versus what you're earning. Her tone softened. It's good that you're helping people, Luke, but you can't help anyone if you lose the ranch. The use of his first name casual now, after days of practicing it, made something warm settle in his chest. He'd asked her to call him Luke, but hearing it actually come from her lips felt different somehow, more real. All right then, he said. What do you suggest? They spent the next hour going over her findings, Abigail explaining where he could cut costs and where he should be charging more. She had a head for numbers that Luke envied and a practical approach to problem solving that didn't rely on complex theories or fancy education. This was common sense organized and applied, and it was exactly what the ranch needed. You're good at this, Luke observed when they finally broke for supper. Abigail looked surprised. At bookkeeping. At thinking things through, seeing the bigger picture. That's a rare skill. My father made sure I had tutors growing up. Said an educated daughter reflected well on him, even if he never intended to let me use that education for anything beyond hosting dinner parties. She paused. I always loved numbers. They made sense in a way people never did. They followed rules, they were predictable. Unlike your father. Unlike everyone. She met his eyes. Until now, maybe. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning Luke wasn't quite ready to examine. He busied himself with serving Stu a simple meal he'd thrown together that morning and changing the subject to safer topics. But that night, lying on his makeshift bed in the storage room, Luke found himself thinking about what she'd said. About predictability and rules. About finding sense in a world that had been chaotic and cruel to her. And he realized that somewhere in the past few days, this arrangement had shifted from temporary charity to something else. Something that felt almost like partnership. The modifications to the cabin continued. Luke widened the front door frame, built the lower work table, and constructed a ramp from scrap lumber that let the wheeled chair navigate the single step at the entrance. Each change made the space more functional, more suited to Abigail's needs. And each change felt like a commitment, like putting down roots that couldn't be easily pulled up. On the 4th day, Luke rode into Redemption for supplies. It was a trip he usually made alone, but as he was preparing to leave, Abigail wheeled up to him. Could you pick up fabric, she asked, and thread if they have it? I've been thinking about what you said about modifying my dresses. If I had the materials, I could at least try. Luke added it to his mental list along with the usual supplies and some extra food, now that there were 2 mouths to feed. The ride into town was familiar. The landscape burned into his memory after 10 years. But this time his mind wasn't on the road. It was back at the cabin, wondering if Abigail would be all right alone for several hours. Wondering if he'd bought enough coffee for 2, wondering when his solitary life had become a life he shared. Redemption hadn't changed since his last visit. The same dusty main street, the same collection of weathered buildings, the same cluster of men outside the saloon who stopped talking when they saw him. Luke ignored them, as he always did, and hitched his horse outside Thompson's general store. Inside the proprietor, a thin man named Eli Thompson looked up from his counter with surprise. Callahan, didn't expect to see you for another week or 2. Running low on supplies, Luke said, pulling out his list. And I need fabric, a few yards of cotton in dark colors, and thread needles, basic sewing supplies. Thompson's eyebrows rose. Fabric? You taking up needlework? Just need it. Wouldn't have anything to do with Sheriff Dugan's daughter, would it? Thompson's tone was carefully neutral, but his eyes were curious. Heard he brought her out to your place few days back. Of course he'd heard. In a town this small, everyone knew everyone else's business, usually before it happened. Luke kept his voice even. She's staying at my ranch. That's so. Thompson moved to pull items from the shelves. Folks are wondering about that, about why you'd take in a crippled girl. Some say it's charity. Others say, he trailed off meaningfully. Others say what? Luke's voice went hard. Nothing, just talk, you know how people are. Thompson set cans of beans and coffee on the counter. Must be lonely out there, though. Man alone for 10 years suddenly has a woman in his house, even one who can't walk. People wonder about things like that. Luke leaned across the counter until Thompson took an involuntary step back. Let me be clear. Miss Dugan is under my protection. Anyone who has questions about my intentions or her reputation can come ask me directly. And anyone who spreads gossip about her will answer to me personally. We understand each other. Thompson swallowed hard. Crystal clear, Callahan. Good. Luke straightened. Now get me that fabric, and make sure it's quality, nothing threadbare or worn. The rest of the transaction passed in tense silence. As Thompson wrapped the purchases, Luke noticed Sheriff Dugan standing across the street watching the store with his arms crossed. Their eyes met briefly, and Luke saw calculation in the older man's gaze. Dugan nodded once, a gesture that could have meant anything or nothing, then turned and walked away. Luke loaded his supplies and headed back to the ranch, the encounter with Thompson sitting heavy in his gut. He'd known there would be talk. A single man taking in a single woman always generated speculation. But hearing it confirmed, knowing that Abigail's reputation was being discussed in saloons and shops, made his jaw clench with anger he couldn't quite name. She deserved better than to be gossip fodder for bored townspeople. When he got back to the cabin, he found Abigail where he'd left her sitting at the table with his ledgers spread before her. She looked up when he entered, and he saw relief flash across her face before she schooled it back to neutrality. "You were gone longer than I expected," she said. "Took time to get everything." He set the packages on the table, including the wrapped fabric. "Got what you asked for. Thompson tried to sell me cheap calico, but I insisted on better quality." Abigail unwrapped the fabric carefully, running her hands over the sturdy cotton. "This is good material. Must have been expensive." "The ranch can afford it." Luke busied himself putting away supplies. "Besides, if you're going to the trouble of making new dresses, they should last." "Thank you." Her voice was soft. "For this, and for, I imagine there was talk in town." Luke glanced at her sharply. "What makes you say that?" "Because there's always talk, especially about someone like me." She folded the fabric with precise movements. "People love to speculate about the crippled girl and the hermit rancher. I'm sure they're having a wonderful time imagining all sorts of scandalous scenarios." "I don't care what they think." "You should. Reputation matters out here, especially for a man trying to run a business. If people think you're keeping me as some kind of—" She trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. "It could affect your ability to sell horses to get fair prices to be taken seriously." Luke crossed the room and crouched beside her chair, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me. I don't give a damn what those people think about me. I stopped caring about public opinion around the same time I buried my family. And as for you, anyone who looks at you and sees something scandalous instead of a woman showing more courage than the lot of them combined isn't worth my time." Abigail's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You say that now. But when business suffers, then business suffers. Some things are more important than money." He stood uncomfortable with his own intensity. "Now, do you want help setting up to work with that fabric, or are you going to spend the evening worrying about what people who don't matter think?" A laugh bubbled out of her, genuine and surprised. "You're impossible." "So I've been told. Come on, let's see if we can fashion you something more practical than that dress." They spent the evening in surprising companionship. Abigail measured and cut while Luke held fabric taut and offered completely unhelpful suggestions that made her laugh. The sound of her laughter, real laughter, not the bitter kind, filled the cabin with something it had been missing for 10 years. Life. Warmth. The sense that these walls held more than just survival. As twilight painted the sky and Luke lit the oil lamp, Abigail held up the beginnings of what would become a new dress. It was simpler than her others, with fewer buttons and a design that would let her manage it herself. Pride showed clearly on her face. "It's going to work," she said wonderingly. "I'll actually be able to dress myself again." "Told you we'd figure it out." Luke poured coffee for them both, settling into the chair across from her. "What else do you need to feel more independent, I mean?" Abigail considered the question seriously. "Better access to the water basin so I can wash up myself. Maybe a way to get myself from the bed to the chair without help, though I don't know if that's possible. It's possible, just needs the right design. Luke's mind was already working on the problem. I could build a frame beside the bed, something you could use to pull yourself up, and lower the base and put it on a stand at chair height. You don't have to rebuild your entire cabin for me. Not rebuilding, improving. He met her eyes over the rim of his cup. A place should work for the people living in it. That just makes sense. They sat in comfortable silence, sipping coffee, while the desert night settled around the cabin. Through the window, stars began to appear more than Luke had ever seen growing up in the city. Out here, the sky went on forever, and sometimes that vastness was comforting rather than lonely. "Luke," Abigail said quietly, "why are you really doing all this?" He'd known the question was coming, had been expecting it since that first day, and he'd spent the past days trying to formulate an answer that made sense. But in the end, the truth was simpler than he'd thought. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said, "and because for 10 years I've been going through the motions of living without really being alive. Working the ranch because it needed working, surviving because giving up seemed like too much effort. But you—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "You remind me what it means to fight for something, to want more than just making it through another day." Abigail's hands trembled on her coffee cup. "I'm not some inspiration, Luke. I'm just trying not to drown. Maybe that's all any of us are doing, but it's easier to keep your head above water when you're not doing it alone." The words settled between them, weighty with implications neither of them was quite ready to name. They finished their coffee in silence, and when Luke carried Abigail to bed that night, her arms lingered around his neck just a moment longer than necessary. Neither of them mentioned it. Some things didn't need words yet. As Luke lay in his storage room later listening to the sounds of Abigail settling for the night, he realized something had fundamentally shifted. This wasn't charity anymore. Wasn't just doing the right thing. Somewhere in the past few days, Abigail Dugan had stopped being a responsibility and become something else entirely. What that something was, Luke wasn't ready to examine. But lying in the darkness, hearing her soft breathing from the next room, he found himself hoping she'd stay long past the point where staying made logical sense, and that hope fragile and new as desert rain felt like the first real thing he'd allowed himself to feel in a decade. Retry PQ Part 3. Lưu ý Viet 6500 Sabichaoyan tứ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phù phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết, lan man kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document Part 3. The Awakening. 2 weeks became 3, and 3 became a month. The modifications to the cabin multiplied until Luke could barely remember what the space had looked like before Abigail arrived. The frame he'd built beside the bed worked better than expected. She could pull herself up and transfer to the chair with minimal help. Now, though, he always stayed close in case she needed him. The lowered work surfaces transformed the kitchen into a space she could navigate, and the widened doorways meant she could move freely between rooms without having to be carried like a child. Independence suited her. Luke watched the change happen gradually like a flower opening to sun. It had been denied. The careful blankness she'd worn like armor began to crack, revealing glimpses of the woman beneath. She smiled, more often laughed at his terrible jokes, and spoke her mind with increasing boldness. The ranch books were immaculate now, organized with a precision that would have made a bank clerk weep with envy, and she'd started taking on other tasks, mending his worn shirts, organizing the cluttered storage room, even attempting to cook despite the limitations of reaching a stove from a seated position. Luke found himself structuring his days around her presence. He'd take his morning coffee at the table so they could talk about the day ahead. He'd work within earshot of the cabin so he could hear if she called for help. And in the evenings, after the chores were done and the desert heat had broken, they'd sit together and just exist in each other's company, sometimes talking, sometimes not, but always aware of each other in a way that felt both comfortable and charged with something unspoken. The morning the rain came, Luke woke to the smell of it, that sharp electric scent that preceded desert storms. He rose quickly, knowing he'd need to secure equipment and bring the horses into the barn before the downpour hit. These late summer storms could be violent, brief, and glorious all at once. Abigail was already awake when he emerged from the storage room, sitting at the table in one of her modified dresses, dark blue cotton that buttoned up the front in a way she could manage alone. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she was staring out the window at the darkening sky with an expression of wonder. "Is it really going to rain?" she asked without looking at him. "Feels like it. Could be a good one, too." Luke moved to the stove, stoking the fire for coffee. "I need to get the animals secured before it hits. You'll be all right here." "I'll be fine." She turned to him then, and he saw excitement in her eyes. "Can I watch from the porch?" Luke hesitated. The covered porch was accessible with the ramp he'd built, but once the storm hit, wind would drive the rain sideways. "It'll be wet out there, and loud." "I don't care. Luke, I haven't seen rain in almost a year, please." The plea in her voice decided him. "All right, but let me get you settled first, wrapped in something waterproof." He worked quickly, helping her onto the porch and wrapping an old oilcloth around her shoulders. The wind was already picking up warm and wild, carrying the scent of creosote and wet earth, even though the rain hadn't started yet. Luke secured the wheeled chair so it wouldn't roll, then touched her shoulder briefly. "I'll be as quick as I can. If it gets to be too much." "It won't be." Abigail's face was tilted toward the sky, her eyes closed. "Go. Do what you need to do." Luke ran to the barn as the first fat drops began to fall. By the time he had the horses secured and the equipment moved under cover, the storm had broken in earnest. Rain hammered down in sheets, turning the dusty yard into a churning mess of mud and running water. Thunder cracked overhead, close enough to feel in his chest, and lightning painted the world in stark flashes of white. He sprinted back to the porch, already soaked through, and found Abigail exactly where he'd left her. The oilcloth had slipped from her shoulders, and rain was plastering her hair to her face, soaking her dress, but she was laughing. Not polite laughter, or even the genuine amusement he'd heard over the past weeks, but wild, unrestrained joy that matched the storm's fury. "Abigail!" Luke had to shout over the thunder. "You're getting drenched." She turned to him, and the expression on her face stole his breath. Her eyes were bright with tears that mixed with the rain, and her smile was incandescent. "I don't care, God, Luke, I forgot how beautiful this was, how alive it makes everything." He understood then. She wasn't just watching the rain, she was feeling it, letting it wash over her like absolution. For months she'd been kept inside, protected and isolated and slowly suffocated by her father's shame. And now she was claiming back something as simple and profound as the right to get caught in a storm. Luke moved to stand beside her chair, rain streaming down his face. "It is beautiful," he said, though he was looking at her rather than the sky. They stayed there until the storm passed, which wasn't long. Desert rains were fierce, but brief, burning themselves out quickly. As the thunder rolled away and the rain gentled to a drizzle, Abigail finally looked at Luke. Her dress clung to her. Her hair hung in wet ropes, and she was shivering slightly from the evaporative cooling, but she looked more alive than he'd ever seen her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for letting me do that." "Don't need to thank me for letting you live." Luke crouched beside her chair. "But we should get you inside and into dry clothes before you catch a chill." The process of getting her changed required more help than usual. Her wet dress clung stubbornly, and her hands were clumsy with cold. Luke tried to give her privacy, turning away while she managed what she could, but inevitably there were moments when he had to help. Moments when his hands brushed against her skin, when he was achingly aware of her as a woman, rather than just someone who needed assistance. Abigail seemed equally affected. Her breath caught when his fingers grazed her shoulder and she wouldn't meet his eyes. The air between them felt charged with something that had nothing to do with the departed storm. "There," Luke said, finally, his voice rougher than intended once she was dressed in dry clothes. "Better?" "Yes, thank you." She finally looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her go still. "Luke, I should change too," he said abruptly, retreating to the storage room before he could do something foolish. Like reaching for her, like closing the distance that had been narrowing between them for weeks. He stripped off his wet clothes with shaking hands, furious with himself. This was exactly what he'd promised wouldn't happen. He'd told her she was safe here, that she didn't have to worry about unwanted attention or expectations. And here he was, thinking about the curve of her shoulder, the softness of her skin, the way her breath had hitched when he touched her. She deserved better than a broken-down rancher who couldn't keep his thoughts appropriate. When he emerged in dry clothes, Abigail was at the stove attempting to make fresh coffee. She'd pulled her wet hair back into a hasty braid, and spots of color rode high on her cheeks. They moved around each other carefully for the rest of the morning, both hyper-aware of the new tension crackling between them. By afternoon, the sun had returned with a vengeance, and the brief rain was already evaporating into humidity that made the air feel thick. Luke worked outside trying to lose himself in physical labor, but his mind kept returning to the cabin, to Abigail, to the way she'd looked in the rain with joy written all over her face. When he finally came inside for the midday meal, he found her crying. She was sitting at the table with her hands pressed to her face, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The ledger lay open in front of her, but Luke didn't think whatever had upset her was related to ranch finances. He crossed to her, immediately kneeling beside the chair. "Abigail, what's wrong? Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak. Luke reached up hesitantly and touched her wrist, and she immediately grabbed his hand, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a world gone liquid. "Talk to me," he said gently. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." "I can't stay here," she managed finally, the words broken by sobs. "I can't keep doing this to you." Luke's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "This morning, the rain, I saw how you looked at me, Luke, and I felt—" She sucked in a shaky breath. "You've been so good to me, so respectful and kind. You've given me independence and dignity and a place to exist without shame. And I'm ruining it by wanting more, by wanting things I have no right to want." Understanding crashed over Luke like a second storm. She thought she was the problem, thought her feelings that apparently mirrored his own, were somehow a betrayal of his generosity. "Abigail." He said her name firmly, waiting until she lowered her hands and looked at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swimming with tears, and her expression was so vulnerable it made his chest ache. "You think you're the only one feeling things you shouldn't—" She blinked. "What?" "You think I haven't noticed how beautiful you are when you laugh, how your hands move when you're working on the book so quick and sure. You think I haven't been lying in that storage room at night thinking about you just on the other side of the wall and trying to convince myself I'm just being a decent human being?" His voice dropped. "You're not the problem here. I am. Because I promised you'd be safe, and now I'm thinking things that no man should think about a woman under his protection." Abigail stared at him, tears still tracking down her face. You have feelings for me." "Yes." The admission felt like jumping off a cliff. "I have feelings for you. Have had them for weeks, maybe since the beginning, and I've been fighting them because you deserve someone who can offer you more than a failing ranch and a man who's better with horses than people." "Luke," she said his name like a revelation. "I don't want more than this. I don't want some wealthy man or social standing or any of the things my father thought mattered. I just want—" She reached up with her free hand and touched his face, her fingers trembling against his jaw. "I want you. I want this life we're building. I want to wake up every morning and have coffee with you and argue about the ranch accounts and watch the rain together." Luke closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "You can walk away from this. From me. I could take you to another town, set you up somewhere safe. You don't have to settle for what? For the first man who's ever treated me like a whole person, for someone who sees past my legs to who I actually am." Her voice strengthened. "That's not settling, Luke. That's choosing. And I choose this. I choose you. If you'll have me." He opened his eyes and found her looking at him with such hope, such desperate wanting, that his last defenses crumbled. "Abigail, I'm 42 years old. I've got a bum shoulder and a small ranch that barely turns a profit. I wake up every morning creaking like an old door, and I'm not good at talking about feelings or any of the things women are supposed to want. You're young and beautiful and smart." "And paralyzed," she interrupted. "Don't forget that part. I can't walk, can't dance, can't do half the things a wife is expected to do. Any children we might have would have to be born with me lying flat because I can't push properly. I'll never be able to stand beside you at church or run to greet you when you come home. Is that what you want to sign up for? Luke stood pulling her up with him, not out of the chair, but bringing her hands to his chest so she could feel his heart hammering. What I want is the woman who had the courage to break her own back rather than surrender her freedom. The woman who learned to do everything over again from a wheelchair and never complained once. The woman who makes me want to be better than I am. He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away her tears. The rest is just logistics. We'll figure it out. Luke, her voice broke on his name. Yeah. Kiss me. He'd imagined it, of course. Lying in the darkness of the storage room, he'd thought about what it would be like to kiss Abigail Dugan. But imagination was nothing compared to reality. When he bent down and pressed his lips to hers, it was like coming home to a place he'd never been. She tasted like salt from her tears, and something sweet he couldn't name, and when her hands came up to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer, he felt something in his chest that had been frozen for a decade finally thaw. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them learning the shape and feel of each other. Then Abigail made a small sound in the back of her throat and deepened it, and gentle became something else entirely. Luke's hand slid to her shoulders, her back holding her close while being mindful of her balance in the chair. She kissed him like she was starving for it, like this was something she'd been denied for so long she'd forgotten it existed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Luke rested his forehead against hers. We should probably talk about this. Talk? Abigail laughed, breathless. We've been talking around it for weeks. I'm done talking. She pulled him back down for another kiss, and Luke surrendered to it completely. His hands mapped the curve of her spine, the warmth of her skin through the cotton dress, the way she trembled under his touch. Her hands explored too, sliding from his hair to his shoulders, to his chest, learning him the way he was learning her. Bed, she whispered against his mouth. Luke, take me to bed. He pulled back enough to see her face. Are you sure we don't have to? I'm sure. Her gray eyes were dark with want. I've never been more sure of anything. Please. Luke lifted her from the chair, cradling her against his chest, as he'd done countless times before. But this time was different. This time, when he carried her to the bed, it wasn't about getting her somewhere safely. It was about bringing her to a place where they could finally acknowledge what had been building between them since that first day. He laid her down carefully, and she immediately reached for him, pulling him down beside her. The afternoon light streaming through the window painted her in gold, and Luke took a moment just to look at her, flushed and wanting and more beautiful than any woman had a right to be. I need to know, he said, brushing hair back from her face. I need to know you're doing this because you want to, not because you feel obligated or grateful or, Luke. She placed her hand over his mouth. I want this. I want you. Not because of what you've done for me, though I'm grateful for that, but because of who you are. Because you make me feel alive again. Because when I'm with you, I'm not the paralyzed girl or the shameful daughter or the burden everyone wants to be rid of. I'm just Abigail, and that's enough. He kissed her palm, then moved her hand so he could kiss her properly. You've always been enough. What followed was tender and awkward and perfect all at once. They moved slowly, discovering each other with a mixture of desire and caution. Luke was hyper-aware of her limitations, careful not to put weight on her legs or move her in ways that might hurt. But Abigail showed him what worked, guiding him with hands and whispered words, and gradually their uncertainty gave way to something deeper. She was responsive in ways that took his breath away, her hands urgent on his skin, her mouth hungry against his. And when he finally joined with her, moving carefully while she wrapped her arms around him and held on, Luke felt something shift fundamentally in his understanding of the world. This wasn't just physical need being met. This was connection, recognition, two broken people choosing to be whole together. Afterward, they lay tangled in sheets, damp with sweat, and afternoon heat, Abigail's head on Luke's chest and his arm around her shoulders. Neither spoke for a long time, just breathed together, while the enormity of what they'd done settled over them. I love you, Abigail said finally, so quietly he almost missed it. I know it's too soon to say that, and you probably think I'm just emotional or confused, but I do. I love you, Luke Callahan. Luke's arm tightened around her. I love you too. He said the words easier than he'd expected. Have for a while now, I think. I just didn't know what to do about it. This. She tilted her head to look at him, a smile playing at her lips. This is what you do about it. He laughed, surprising himself, and kissed the top of her head. They stayed like that as the afternoon stretched toward evening, talking about everything and nothing, about childhoods and dreams and disappointments, about the future they might build together if they were brave enough to try, about practical things like whether the cabin could support a family if children came, and about impossible things like whether Abigail might regain some mobility with time and care. I need to tell you something, Abigail said eventually, about my father. About why I'm really terrified of him finding out about this. Luke waited, his hand moving in slow circles on her back. The accident, me jumping from the horse, happened because I overheard him talking to the territorial governor's son, the man I was supposed to marry. Her voice went flat, emotionless, in the way it did when she was protecting herself from feeling too much. They were discussing our wedding night. My father was assuring him that my reluctance didn't matter, that I'd be compliant once I was legally his property. He said... She swallowed hard. He said a woman who fought too hard could be broken with the right application of force, and they laughed about it. Luke felt rage rise in him, hot and violent. Jesus Christ, Abigail. I realized then that my father didn't just see me as a tool for advancement. He saw me as an object, something to be used and discarded and broken if necessary to serve his purposes. She pressed closer to Luke as if seeking warmth. So I ran. And when running wasn't enough, I jumped, because I'd rather be broken in a way I chose than in a way they chose for me. I'm glad you jumped, Luke said fiercely. I'm glad you survived. And I swear to God, Abigail, your father will never touch you again, never control you or hurt you or take away what you've built here. He'll try. Once he finds out about us, he'll claim I'm being taken advantage of, that you're abusing his helpless daughter. He'll use the law or public opinion or whatever tool he can find to separate us because in his mind, I'm still his property. Then we'll fight him, together. Abigail pulled back enough to meet his eyes. You don't understand. My father doesn't lose. He's a powerful man with powerful friends, and he'll destroy you just to prove he can. Your ranch, your reputation, everything you've built, he'll take it all. Let him try. Luke's jaw set with determination. I've lost everything before. I survived it, but I won't lose you. Not without the fight of his life. She searched his face, looking for doubt or fear, and found only resolve. You really mean that? Every word. You're mine now, Abigail, and I protect what's mine. The possessiveness in his voice should have frightened her, but instead it made her feel safe. After a lifetime of being claimed as property, being claimed as someone precious was revolutionary. She kissed him again, pouring everything she couldn't say into the gesture. They made love again as the sun set slower this time, savoring each touch and kiss. And when darkness finally fell and Luke lit the oil lamp, they lay together in the golden glow and talked about futures that had seemed impossible just hours before. We should get married, Luke said suddenly. Soon, before your father has a chance to interfere. Abigail blinked at him. Are you proposing? I'm stating a fact. He rolled onto his side to face her properly. But if you want pretty words and romance, I can manage that too. Abigail Dugan, you're the bravest, smartest, most stubborn woman I've ever met. You've turned my empty cabin into a home and my survival into a life worth living. I want to wake up next to you every morning and argue with you about ranch accounts every afternoon and fall asleep with you in my arms every night. I want whatever children we're blessed with and whatever challenges come with them. I want to grow old with you such as it is. So yes, I'm proposing. Will you marry me? Tears spilled down Abigail's cheeks, but she was smiling. Yes. God, yes. But Luke, marriage won't stop my father. It might make things worse. Don't care. At least as my wife, you'll have legal protections he can't touch. And it sends a message you've chosen this life, chosen me. That choice matters. It does matter. She touched his face wonderingly. I never thought I'd get to choose anything. Well, you're choosing now. Choose me every day and I'll choose you right back. They sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted like salt and hope and the beginning of something that could withstand whatever storms came next. Outside, the desert had settled into its nighttime rhythms, cool air, replacing the day's heat. Inside the cabin, two people who'd been alone for too long had finally found each other. It wouldn't be easy. Abigail's father would indeed try to separate them, and the town would have opinions that ranged from scandal to outright condemnation. There would be hard days ahead, challenges they couldn't yet imagine, fights and fears, and all the messy reality of building a life together. But lying in that bed with Abigail in his arms and love declared between them, Luke Callahan felt something he hadn't felt in a decade. Not just hope, that fragile thing that could be crushed too easily, but certainty. The bone-deep knowledge that whatever came next, they'd face it together. And that made all the difference. Retry PQ, Part 4, lưu ý việc sâu số mỹ change sẽ bị xen từ liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề tránh ngắt quãng, đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính, không viết lân man, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document Part 4, The Showdown. They had 3 days of peace before Sheriff Marcus Dugan learned what had happened between his daughter and the rancher he dumped her on. 3 days in which Luke and Abigail existed in a bubble of new love and tentative planning, discussing how to arrange a quiet wedding and what modifications the cabin would need if children eventually came. 3 days of waking up together, of shared meals and shared laughter, of building something real from the foundation they'd been laying since that first afternoon. The bubble burst on a Thursday morning when Deputy Tom Reeves rode up to the ranch with his hat in his hands, an apology written all over his young face. Luke was working on reinforcing the corral fence when he heard the horse approach. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, and felt his gut tighten when he recognized the deputy's bay mare. Official visits were never good news, and the way Reeves sat his saddle, nervous and uncomfortable, suggested this was worse than usual. "Callahan," Reeves called out as he dismounted. He was barely 25, fresh-faced and earnest, one of the few decent men working under Dugan's authority. "Got a message from the sheriff." Luke set down his hammer and walked to meet him, keeping his body between the deputy and the cabin where Abigail was working on the ledgers. "What kind of message?" Reeves glanced toward the cabin, then back at Luke. "The kind you're not going to like. Sheriff wants his daughter back. Says you've had her long enough and it's time she returned to town where she belongs." "She's not going back." "Look, I figured you'd say that." Reeves shifted his weight uncomfortably. "And between you and me, I don't blame you. Everyone knows how the sheriff treated her, but he's demanding she come back, and if you refuse, he's threatening to come out here himself with a few men and take her by force. Claims you're holding her against her will." Luke felt cold fury settle in his chest. Against her will. That's rich coming from the man who dumped her here like unwanted cargo. "I know. Hell, the whole town knows. But Sheriff Dugan's got a story ready, says he left her here temporarily for her health, that you were supposed to be her caretaker, and now you've taken advantage of her vulnerable state." Reeves looked miserable. He's been talking to people planting seeds, making it sound like you're some kind of predator who saw an opportunity with a helpless woman. And people believe him. Some do, some don't. But enough believe him that he thinks he can get away with whatever he's planning. Reeves lowered his voice. "Callahan, I'm here as a courtesy because I respect you and because Miss Abigail deserves better than what her father's offering. But I got to deliver the official message. Sheriff Dugan demands you release his daughter into his custody within 24 hours, or he'll consider it kidnapping and act accordingly." From behind Luke, Abigail's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Tell my father I'm not his property to demand back." Both men turned to find her sitting in her wheeled chair on the porch, having maneuvered down the ramp on her own. Her face was pale, but set with determination, and her hands gripped the chair's wheels with white-knuckled intensity. She'd obviously heard everything. "Miss Dugan," Reeves touched his hat respectfully. "I'm sorry about this, truly." "Are you sorry enough to tell my father the truth? Deputy, that Luke Callahan has treated me with more respect and dignity in 6 weeks than my father showed me in 25 years. That I'm here by choice, not by force." Reeves looked torn. "I can tell him that, ma'am, but I don't think it'll change his mind. He seems pretty set on getting you back." "It's not about getting me back," Abigail said bitterly. It's about control. About not letting anyone, especially not me, defy him and get away with it. He doesn't want me. He wants to win. Luke moved to stand beside her chair, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. The gesture was protective and possessive, and from the way Reeves's eyes widened slightly, the deputy understood exactly what it meant. "Miss Dugan," Reeves said carefully. "Is it true, then, what folks in town are saying about you and Callahan?" "That depends on what they're saying. But if they're saying we're together, that I've chosen to stay here with him, then yes, it's true." Abigail reached up to cover Luke's hand with her own. "Luke and I are getting married, as soon as we can arrange it." Reeves let out a low whistle. "Well, that's going to complicate things considerably." "Why?" Luke's voice was hard. "She's of legal age. She's making her own choice. Her father has no say in who she marries." "Legally, you're right. But the sheriff's already spinning a different story. Says you coerced her, took advantage of her disability and isolation. He's got Judge Hartwell considering a competency hearing, claims Miss Abigail isn't in her right mind to make decisions about her own future." "That's insane," Abigail snapped. "I'm paralyzed, not simple-minded." "I know that, ma'am, but your father's convincing, and he's got enough influence to make trouble even if he can't win legally in the end. A competency hearing could tie things up for months, and in the meantime," Reeves trailed off meaningfully. "In the meantime, he'd insist she be remanded to his custody pending the hearing," Luke finished, "which is exactly what he wants to separate us and break her down until she's compliant again." "That's my read on it, yeah." Reeves shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I shouldn't be telling you this, but the sheriff's planning to ride out here tomorrow morning with a couple of his men. He's going to make this look official, probably try to force the issue. You might want to, I don't know, have a plan." I have a plan," Luke said grimly. "It involves not letting him take her. Callahan don't do anything stupid. The sheriff's looking for an excuse to charge you with something more serious than interference. You pull a gun on him or his deputies and he'll have you arrested or worse." "Then what do you suggest, Reeves?" "That I just hand her over, let him drag her back to that house, and lock her away until she forgets what freedom feels like." The deputy looked genuinely pained. "I suggest you get married, today, right now. Find someone who'll perform the ceremony, hell. There's a circuit preacher staying at the boarding house in town. Get married before the sheriff can stop you, and then at least you've got legal standing as her husband. It won't stop him from causing trouble, but it makes it a hell of a lot harder for him to claim you're taking advantage of her." Luke and Abigail exchanged a glance. They'd been planning to wait to do things properly with a proper ceremony and proper arrangements. But Reeves was right. Waiting gave Dugan time to maneuver, time to build his case and turn public opinion. If they were already married when he showed up, it changed everything. "Can you do us a favor, Deputy?" Abigail asked. "Can you ride back to town and ask that circuit preacher if he'll come out here this afternoon? Tell him we'll pay him whatever he asks." Reeves nodded slowly. "I can do that. And Miss Dugan, for what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. Callahan's a good man, better than most in these parts." He mounted his horse, then paused. "One more thing. When the sheriff comes tomorrow, don't meet him alone. Have witnesses if you can. People who can testify later that everything was done properly, that Miss Dugan stated her choice clearly and of her own free will. It might not stop him, but it could help in the long run." "We'll keep that in mind," Luke said. "Thank you, Reeves, for the warning and the advice." The deputy tipped his hat and rode off, leaving Luke and Abigail alone with the weight of what was coming. Luke crouched beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. "Are you sure about this getting married today rushed like this? It's not how either of us pictured it." "I don't care about the ceremony, Luke. I care about us, about making sure my father can't separate us." She squeezed his hands. "Besides, I've already chosen you. A preacher saying words over us just makes it official. Still, you deserve better than a hurried wedding with your father breathing down our necks." "I deserve you," Abigail said firmly. "Everything else is just details." They spent the rest of the morning preparing. Luke rode to the neighboring ranch, a small spread run by a widow named Martha Cole and her 2 grown sons, and explained the situation. Martha, who'd had her own run-ins with Sheriff Dugan over water rights, immediately offered to stand as witness and to bring her sons along as additional support when the sheriff showed up the next day. "That man's a bully and a tyrant," Martha declared, her weathered face set with determination. About time someone stood up to him. You marry that girl proper Luke Callahan, and we'll make sure Dugan knows she's protected by more than just you. Back at the ranch, Abigail had transformed herself as best she could with limited resources. She'd put on her best dress, one of the modified ones she'd made dark green cotton with simple lines, and pinned her hair up with careful precision. She'd even found a few late-blooming wildflowers near the well and fashioned them into a small bouquet. When Luke returned and saw her waiting on the porch, his breath caught. "You're beautiful," he said simply. Color rose in her cheeks. "It's nothing fancy." "Don't need fancy. You're perfect as you are." The circuit preacher arrived just after noon, a weathered man in his 60s named Reverend Samuel Stone. He took one look at Abigail in her wheeled chair and Luke standing protectively beside her, and his expression softened with understanding. "Deputy Reeves explained the situation," he said without preamble. "You're the sheriff's daughter, and you're choosing to marry this man despite your father's objections." "That's correct, Reverend," Abigail said clearly. "I'm 25 years old and of sound mind. I'm marrying Luke Callahan of my own free will with full understanding of what I'm doing." Reverend Stone nodded approvingly. "Good, clear and decisive. That's what we'll need if there's legal challenges later." He turned to Luke. "And you, son? You understand you're taking on responsibility for a wife who'll need extra care, that it won't always be easy." "I understand, Reverend, and I'm ready for it." "Then let's not waste time. Love's hard enough to find in this world without letting fools with badges tear it apart." They held the ceremony right there on the porch with Martha Cole and her sons as witnesses. It was brief and unadorned, no music, no decorations, just the essential words that bound two lives together. But when Reverend Stone asked Luke to state his intentions, the rancher's voice was steady and sure. "I take you, Abigail Dugan, as my wife. I promise to protect you, to honor you, to be your partner in all things. I promise that your voice will matter. Your choices will be respected, and your independence will be preserved. What's mine is yours. Where I go, you're welcome, and no one, not your father, not the law, not anyone will take you from me without going through me first." Abigail's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was equally strong when it was her turn. "I take you, Luke Callahan, as my husband. I promise to stand with you to build this life we're creating, to be your partner in all things. I promise that I won't let fear or doubt or my father's threats come between us. What's mine is yours. Where you go, I go, and anyone who tries to separate us will find I'm not nearly as helpless as I look." Reverend Stone smiled at that. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona and Almighty God, I pronounce you husband and wife. Son, you may kiss your bride." Luke bent and kissed Abigail with a tenderness that made Martha Cole dab at her eyes. When they broke apart, they were both smiling. Not the carefree smiles of people without troubles, but the determined smiles of people who'd chosen each other despite everything. "Now then," Reverend Stone said, pulling out an official-looking document. "Let's get this marriage certificate signed and witnessed properly. The more documentation we have, the harder it'll be for anyone to claim this wasn't legitimate." They signed with careful precision, and Martha and her sons added their signatures as witnesses. Reverend Stone filled in all the details, noting the date and time, and then made them each sign a second statement affirming that the marriage was voluntary and freely entered into. "Keep these safe," he told Luke, handing over the papers, "and I'd suggest filing a copy with the Territorial Records Office as soon as possible. Better to have it official before your father-in-law tries to challenge it." "We will, Reverend. Thank you for coming out here on short notice. Thank you for giving me the chance to unite two people who actually want to be married. That's rarer than you'd think in my line of work." He shook Luke's hand and then took Abigail's carefully. "You're a brave woman, Mrs. Callahan. Your father's not going to take this well." "I know," Abigail said, "but I'm not facing him alone anymore." Martha and her sons stayed for a simple meal, beans and cornbread, that Abigail had managed to prepare despite the chaos of the day. They talked strategy, discussing how to handle the sheriff's inevitable arrival. Martha's older son, James, suggested they have rifles visible, but not aimed a show of preparedness without direct threat. "Dugan respects force," James said. "Always has. He backs down when he realizes he can't win through intimidation. But you gotta stand firm, show any weakness, and he'll exploit it. We'll stand firm, sir, Luke said, glancing at Abigail. Won't we? We will. Her jaw was set in that determined way he'd come to recognize. My father's had control of my life for 25 years. That ends tomorrow. After Martha and her sons left, promising to return at dawn, Luke and Abigail sat together in the evening quiet. The reality of what they'd done and what was coming settled over them like the descending darkness. Are you scared? Luke asked quietly. Terrified, Abigail admitted. But more for you than for me. My father will try to destroy you, Luke. He'll use every tool at his disposal to punish you for this. Let him try. I've got something he doesn't. I've got a reason to fight that goes beyond pride and control. I'm fighting for you, for us. That makes all the difference. She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. They stayed like that as the stars emerged one by one, drawing comfort from each other's presence. Luke thought about tomorrow, about the confrontation that was inevitable, and felt no fear, only resolution. Abigail was his wife now, legal and proper. Marcus Dugan had lost his claim on her, whether he accepted it or not. Sleep came hard that night, both of them too aware of what morning would bring. But Luke held Abigail close, his wife, that fact still new enough to bring wonder, and drew strength from her breathing, her warmth, her absolute trust in him. Whatever happened tomorrow, they'd face it together. Dawn broke clear and hot, promising another scorching day. Luke was up before the sun, double-checking preparations. The marriage certificate was tucked safely in a strongbox with copies made by Abigail's neat hand. The cabin was in order, giving no ammunition to anyone who might claim Abigail was being kept in poor conditions. And Luke's rifle was cleaned and loaded, leaning against the wall by the door where it could be reached quickly if needed. Martha Cole and her sons arrived just as the sun cleared the horizon, bringing fresh bread and coffee and moral support. They positioned themselves strategically, Martha on the porch, with Abigail James and his brother Jacob flanking the yard's entrance, not threatening but present, witnesses to whatever transpired. You ready for this? Martha asked Abigail quietly. As ready as I'll ever be. Abigail's hands were steady as she folded them in her lap. Thank you for being here, for standing with us. Wouldn't be anywhere else, honey. Your father's needed someone to stand up to him for years. About time it happened. They didn't have to wait long. Just after 7, the sound of multiple horses announced the sheriff's arrival. Marcus Dugan rode at the head of a group of 5 himself, 2 deputies including Reeves and 2 men Luke recognized as ranch hands who'd done occasional work for the sheriff, an intimidation tactic bringing that many men for one paralyzed woman. Luke stepped off the porch to meet them, positioning himself between the approaching riders and his wife. He kept his hands visible and away from his gun, but his stance was unmistakable. This far, and no farther. Dugan reined in his horse 20 feet away, his florid face already showing irritation. He'd dressed for the occasion in his finest vest and cleanest hat, every inch the lawman on official business. But his eyes, when they swept the scene, betrayed surprise at the number of people present. Callahan, he said, his voice carrying authority he probably didn't feel. I'm here to collect my daughter and bring her back to town where she belongs. She's not going anywhere, Luke replied calmly. Abigail is exactly where she belongs, in her home with her husband. The word husband landed like a physical blow. Dugan's face went from florid to purple in seconds. Her what? Her husband. Luke gestured toward the porch where Abigail sat with Martha beside her. Abigail and I were married yesterday afternoon by Reverend Samuel Stone, with witnesses present and all legal documents properly executed and signed. She's Mrs. Luke Callahan now, and she stays with me. For a moment, Dugan seemed too shocked to respond. Then rage replaced shock, and he swung down from his horse with surprising speed for a man his size. You son of a bitch! You took advantage of a helpless woman, coerced her into marriage while she was vulnerable and isolated. I did nothing of the sort. Luke's voice remained level. Abigail married me of her own free will. She can tell you herself. Dugan started to push past Luke, but the rancher moved to block him. You don't touch her. You don't come near her. You gave up that right when you dumped her here 6 weeks ago. I'm her father. You're the man who called her useless and got rid of her like broken furniture. Being a father requires more than biology, Dugan. It requires giving a damn about your child's welfare. You failed that test a long time ago." Dugan's hand moved toward his gun, and immediately the tableau shifted. James Cole's rifle came up, not aimed, but ready. Jacob's hand settled on his own sidearm. Even Deputy Reeves tensed, though Luke couldn't tell whose side he'd take if violence erupted. From the porch, Abigail's voice rang out clear and strong. "Father, stop!" Everyone froze. Dugan turned slowly to look at his daughter, and for the first time Luke saw something like uncertainty cross the sheriff's face. Abigail sat straight in her chair, chin high, every inch a woman in command of herself, despite the wheeled chair beneath her. "Abigail?" Dugan started, his tone shifting to something that might have been intended as fatherly concern. "Sweetheart, you don't understand what this man has done. He's manipulated you, taken advantage." "No." The single word cut through his placation like a knife. "Luke Callahan has been nothing but respectful and kind. He's treated me like a human being with value and agency. He's given me independence, dignity, and choice. Everything you took away from me. I was protecting you. You were controlling me." Abigail's voice rose, months of suppressed anger finally finding release. "You were grooming me to marry a man who terrified me so you could advance your political career. You dismissed my fears, ignored my objections, and when I chose breaking my back over marrying him, you blamed me for embarrassing you. You kept me locked in my room for 6 months telling everyone it was for my health, when really it was because you couldn't stand looking at your imperfect daughter. And then you gave me away to a stranger like I was trash you needed to dispose of." Each accusation hit like a physical blow, and Dugan actually took a step back. Around them, the deputies and ranch hands shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the story they'd been told. This was something ugly or raw and impossible to dismiss. "That's not, I never," Dugan sputtered, his carefully constructed narrative crumbling. "You did?" Abigail continued relentlessly. "And you know what? It was the best thing you ever did for me. Because Luke saw what you never could, that I'm more than my legs. More than a political tool or a burden or a disappointment. He saw me, the real me. And he gave me the chance to build a life worth living." She wheeled forward slightly, and Martha moved aside to let her come to the edge of the porch. "I married Luke Callahan yesterday of my own free will. I'm his wife legally and by choice. And I'm telling you now in front of all these witnesses that I want nothing to do with you. You are no longer my father in any way that matters. You have no say in my life, no claim on my future, and no right to come to my home and make demands. Is that clear enough for you?" The silence that followed was absolute. Dugan stood there, his face working through emotions too fast to track rage, humiliation, disbelief, and something that might have been grief if he were capable of such feeling. Behind him, even his hired men looked uncomfortable with the situation. "You ungrateful—" Dugan started taking a step toward the porch. Luke moved immediately, positioning himself in the sheriff's path again. "That's far enough. You heard your daughter. She's made her choice. Time for you to respect it and leave. Like hell, she's not of sound mind to make these decisions. I'll get a competency hearing. I'll prove you coerced her. Go ahead and try." Luke's voice was steel. "We've got signed statements from Reverend Stone and 3 witnesses testifying that Abigail was clear, articulate, and fully aware when she married me. We've got properly executed legal documents filed with the territorial office. And we've got the testimony of everyone here who just heard her explain in her own words why she chose this. What do you have the word of a father who abandoned his daughter and now wants her back only because she dared to defy him?" Dugan looked around wildly, seeming to realize for the first time that he'd lost control of the situation. His men wouldn't meet his eyes. Deputy Reeves was staring hard at the ground. Even the ranch hands he'd brought for intimidation looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. "You'll regret this, Callahan," Dugan said, finally, his voice low and venomous. "I'll make sure of it. I'll ruin you. I'll see this ranch seized for back taxes or unpaid debts. I'll make it impossible for you to sell your horses, to buy supplies, to do business anywhere in the territory. By the time I'm done with you, by the time you're done with me, I'll still have Abigail." Luke's voice was quiet, but absolute. "And that means I've already won. You can take my ranch, my reputation, everything I own, but you can't take her. She's mine now, and I'm hers. That's something you'll never understand because you've never loved anything more than your own pride." The truth of it hung in the air between them. Dugan opened his mouth, closed it, and for the first time in his life looked like a man with nothing left to say. He turned abruptly and mounted his horse, his movements jerky with barely controlled rage. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," Abigail replied. "Goodbye, father. Don't come back." Dugan jerked his reins and rode off, his men following in uncomfortable silence. Only Deputy Reeves paused, looking back at Luke and Abigail with something like respect. "For what it's worth," he called quietly, "I think you did the right thing, both of you." Then he too rode away, leaving the small group in the yard to watch until the dust settled and the riders disappeared over the horizon. The tension broke like a snapped wire. Martha let out a shaky breath and moved to put a hand on Abigail's shoulder. James and Jacob lowered their rifles, and Luke climbed the porch steps to kneel beside his wife's chair, taking her trembling hands in his. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. "I was terrified." Abigail's voice shook despite her brave words. "Luke, he meant those threats. He'll try to destroy you." "Let him try. We'll deal with it together." He kissed her hands. "You stood up to him. After everything he did to you, you looked him in the eye and chose yourself. That's more than victory. That's freedom." Abigail pulled one hand free to touch his face, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I love you. I love you too. More than I thought I could love anything again." Martha cleared her throat meaningfully. "All right, you two. That's enough sentiment for one morning. Let's get inside and have some of that coffee before it gets cold. We've got celebrating to do. You just won your independence after all." They gathered in the cabin, the witnesses and the newlyweds, and talked and laughed with the kind of relief that comes after surviving something harrowing. Marcus Dugan would indeed try to cause trouble, they all knew that. But he'd lost his primary weapon, fear. Abigail wasn't afraid of him anymore. And without that fear to control her, his power evaporated. Later, after Martha and her sons had left, and the day had worn toward evening, Luke and Abigail sat together on the porch and watched the sun paint the sky in shades of amber and gold. The crisis had passed, the battle was won, and ahead of them stretched the rest of their lives, uncertain in many ways, but certain in the only way that mattered. They had each other. And that was enough. Retry PQ Part 5 Louis viết 100 năm. Nhìn, từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề tránh ngắt quãng, đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không Việt, làn mạn kết thúc, phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Louis trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, Part 5, The Home They Built. The threatened destruction never came. Marcus Dugan tried, of course, filed complaints with the territorial office, spread rumors in town, even attempted to have the marriage annulled on grounds of coercion. But every legal challenge crumbled against the solid documentation and witness testimony Luke and Abigail had prepared. After 3 months of failed maneuvers, the sheriff seemed to accept defeat, though Luke suspected it was less acceptance and more strategic retreat. Men like Dugan didn't forget slights to their pride. But as weeks turned to months and no further attacks materialized, Luke allowed himself to believe they might actually have won. More importantly, he watched Abigail transform from the careful, guarded woman he'd first met into someone he barely recognized, someone lighter, freer, more fully herself than she'd perhaps ever been allowed to be. The first garden went in during October when the brutal summer heat finally broke and the desert remembered it could be merciful. Abigail designed its sketching plans on paper with careful attention to what could be reached from her chair and what Luke would need to tend. They built raised beds from salvaged lumber, positioning them at heights that worked for both of them, and planted winter vegetables that could survive the occasional frost. Luke had expected to do most of the work himself, but Abigail surprised him. She'd wheel out in the cool mornings with her hands wrapped in work gloves, dirt streaking her modified dresses, and spend hours planting seeds with a precision that came from finally having something that was hers to nurture. Her hands, which had been kept soft and useless by her father's insistence on ladylike behavior, developed calluses that matched Luke's own. "You're going to ruin your hands," he'd observed one morning, half teasing as she tamped soil around a tomato seedling. "Good," Abigail had replied without looking up. "I want working hands. Hands that build things and grow things and have purpose. I spent 25 years with decorative hands. I'm done with decorative." The garden thrived under their combined attention, and so did the ranch. With Abigail managing the finances and Luke free to focus on the horses, the operation began turning its first real profit in years. She renegotiated contracts, found better suppliers, and implemented a pricing structure that was fair but firm. Word spread that Callahan Ranch had gotten its affairs in order, and customers who'd been hesitant to do business with a hermit rancher found themselves impressed by the sharp-minded woman who handled the books. Some people in Redemption whispered, of course. Speculation about the nature of their marriage, about whether Abigail was truly happy or merely trapped in a different kind of cage. But those whispers died when folks actually saw them together at the general store, where Abigail now accompanied Luke on supply runs at church, on the occasional Sunday they attended at the quarterly horse auction, where she sat beside him and offered quiet counsel on pricing. They didn't look like master and captive. They looked like partners, like two people who'd found in each other something the rest of the world couldn't understand but couldn't deny either. Martha Cole became a regular visitor, bringing news from town and feminine company that Abigail had been starved for. The two women would sit on the porch for hours, Abigail's hands busy with mending while Martha shelled beans or worked on her own endless repairs, talking about everything from garden pests to territorial politics to the kind of intimate subjects women shared away from men's ears. "You look happy," Martha observed one afternoon in late November when the air had gone crisp and the light had that particular golden quality that only came in autumn. "Really happy, not just making the best of it happy." Abigail looked up from the shirt she was mending, one of Luke's, torn on a fence nail, and smiled. "I am happy. Happier than I ever thought I could be. Even with the chair, even with the limitations. The chair is part of my life, but it's not my whole life. That's what I couldn't make my father understand. He saw the paralysis and decided I was over, that nothing about me mattered anymore because I couldn't walk. But Luke," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "Luke sees me, all of me, the parts that work and the parts that don't, and he treats all of it as equally real, equally valuable." Martha nodded knowingly. "That's what a good marriage is, I think. Not someone who overlooks your flaws, but someone who sees them clearly and loves you anyway." "Exactly." Abigail returned to her mending, a small smile playing at her lips. "Though I'll admit there are days I wish I could do more. Wish I could help with the heavier ranch work, or stand beside him when he's repairing the barn, or just walk across the yard without needing the chair. That's natural. But from what I can see, you contribute plenty. This ranch runs better now than it did in the 10 years before you arrived. Luke told James that you've doubled his profits and organized his chaos. That's not nothing." "I know, and Luke reminds me of that whenever I get frustrated. He has a way of seeing what I bring rather than what I can't do." She tied off the thread and held up the shirt, examining her work. "Sometimes I think about the life my father wanted for me. The society marriage, the social obligations, the endless performance of being the perfect daughter. And I realize that even if I could walk again, I wouldn't trade this for that. This life is real. It's mine. That matters more than mobility ever could." Inside the cabin, things had settled into comfortable rhythms. Luke had moved his belongings from the storage room into the main space, and they shared the bed without awkwardness now. The intimacy that had frightened them both at first had become natural, a language they spoke fluently in the darkness. Luke learned what pleased her, how to touch her in ways that made her gasp and arch, and forget everything but the feeling of his hands on her skin. And Abigail learned him too, discovered that the taciturn rancher had depths of passion he'd kept locked away for a decade. They made love often, sometimes tender and slow, sometimes urgent and desperate, always with an underlying current of gratitude that they'd found each other at all. And in the aftermath, tangled in sheets with the desert night cooling around them, they talked about futures that seemed less impossible with each passing day. "I want children," Abigail said one night in December, her head on Luke's chest and his arm around her shoulders. "I know it might be complicated with my condition, but I want to try." Luke's hand stilled where it had been tracing lazy patterns on her arm. Are you sure? I've heard it can be dangerous for women with spinal injuries. The doctors might not even know how to. I'm sure. She propped herself up to look at him. I've been reading everything I can find about pregnancy and paralysis. It's rare, but it has been done. Women have carried babies to term and delivered them safely. It requires careful monitoring and probably a doctor who knows what he's doing, but it's possible. And you want to risk it for a baby for our baby. She touched his face. Luke, my father, spent my whole life telling me I was only valuable as a breeding tool for his ambitions. And then after the accident, he decided I was worthless because I couldn't fulfill even that function. I want to prove him wrong. I want to create life with you, not because someone demands it or because it serves a purpose, but because we choose it, because we want a family that's built on love instead of obligation. Luke pulled her back down against him, his throat tight with emotion. Then we'll try. And whatever happens, we'll face it together. Together. She agreed, kissing his chest where his heart beat strong and steady beneath her lips. The new year of 1874 arrived with a cold snap that surprised even longtime Arizona residents. Luke spent extra time ensuring the animals were protected from the unusual weather, and Abigail kept the cabin warm with careful fire management and the thick quilts Martha had brought as a belated wedding gift. On a January morning, when frost painted the windows in delicate patterns, Abigail woke feeling strange. Not sick exactly, but different in a way she couldn't quite name. Her breasts were tender, and the smell of the coffee Luke was making turned her stomach unexpectedly. She lay in bed for a moment, taking inventory of her body, and felt a flutter of something that might have been hope or might have been fear. Luke, she called, her voice uncertain. Could you come here? He appeared immediately, concern written across his face. What's wrong? Are you hurt? No, I'm not hurt. I'm just... She paused, hardly daring to voice the possibility. I think I might be with child. Luke went very still. You think, how can you tell? My monthly courses are late. Not by much, just a week or so, but they're usually regular. And this morning the coffee smell made me feel ill, and my breasts are tender. She reached for his hand. It might be too early to know for certain, but I think something's changed. Luke sat on the edge of the bed, his hand engulfing hers. A baby, he said wonderingly. We're going to have a baby. Maybe. Possibly. We shouldn't get our hopes up too high until we're certain. Too late. My hopes are already sky high. He leaned down to kiss her forehead, then her lips, then her belly through the nightgown. Hello in there if you're real. This is your father. Your mother and I are already half in love with you. Abigail laughed, tears stinging her eyes. You're ridiculous. I'm happy. There's a difference. They decided to wait another month before riding into town to see the doctor, giving time for the pregnancy to establish itself more firmly. During that time, Luke became absurdly protective, insisting Abigail rest more, take on fewer chores, avoid anything that might strain her. She tolerated his fussing with bemused patience, understanding it came from love, even when it verged on suffocating. The garden they'd planted in the fall had begun producing, and Abigail spent her mornings harvesting vegetables and planning the spring planting. The physical work felt good, grounding her in her body, even as that body began changing in ways both familiar and strange. Her stomach remained flat, but she felt different inside, fuller, somehow more aware of the life potentially growing within her. When they finally made the trip to town in February, Dr. Benjamin Walsh examined Abigail with professional detachment that gradually gave way to genuine interest. He was an older man, educated back east before coming west for his health, and he approached Abigail's unique situation with scientific curiosity rather than judgment. Well, Mrs. Callahan, he said after his examination, you are indeed pregnant. I'd estimate you're about 10 weeks along, which means you should deliver sometime in early September. Abigail's hand found Luke's and squeezed hard. And the paralysis? Will it complicate things? Dr. Walsh removed his spectacles and cleaned them thoughtfully. I won't lie to you, this is territory I have limited experience with. I've delivered hundreds of babies, but never from a mother with spinal paralysis. However, I've consulted my medical texts and I can tell you what I know. He launched into an explanation of the challenges they'd face. Abigail's inability to feel or control the lower half of her body meant she couldn't push effectively during labor, which might require intervention. The pregnancy itself could cause complications with circulation and pressure sores, and there was always the risk that her body couldn't handle the additional strain. But he continued seeing their faces fall. I've also read accounts of successful pregnancies in similar circumstances. The key is careful monitoring and preparation. I'll want to see you monthly until the last trimester, then weekly. We'll watch for any signs of distress and plan for a delivery that works with your limitations rather than against them. Can she do this? Luke asked bluntly. Honestly, doctor. Will this pregnancy kill her? Dr. Walsh met his gaze squarely. Any pregnancy carries risk, Mr. Callahan. Mrs. Callahan's paralysis adds additional complications. Yes, but she's young, otherwise healthy, and clearly determined. If we're careful and don't take unnecessary chances, I believe she can carry this baby to term and deliver safely. I won't guarantee it. Medicine doesn't allow for guarantees, but I'm cautiously optimistic. It was enough. They left the doctor's office with a list of instructions and precautions, and with the knowledge that in 7 months, if all went well, they'd be parents. The reality of it hit them both as they rode back to the ranch, Abigail secure in the wagon bed with cushions Luke had arranged for her comfort. Are you scared? Abigail asked as they bounced along the rutted road. Terrified, Luke admitted, but also excited in a way I haven't been since... He stopped himself, but Abigail understood. Since before his first wife and son had died. This was a second chance he'd never expected to get. Me too, she said quietly. Terrified and excited and grateful all at once. Even if something goes wrong, even if we lose the baby or I don't survive the birth. Don't talk like that. Listen to me, Luke. Even if the worst happens, I need you to know I wouldn't trade this. Any of this. You gave me a life worth living, and now you're giving me the chance to create new life. That's more than I ever dreamed of having. Luke pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed back to sit beside her, pulling her into his arms. Nothing's going to happen to you. I won't allow it. You can't control everything, my love. Watch me try. The pregnancy progressed through spring and into summer with remarkable smoothness. Abigail's belly grew round and prominent, a visible reminder of the life they'd created together. She experienced the usual discomforts, morning sickness, that extended well past morning fatigue that made her nap in the afternoon food cravings, that sent Luke on desperate searches for pickled beets or honey candy, but nothing that suggested serious complications. The baby moved constantly, and Abigail would guide Luke's hand to her belly so he could feel the kicks and rolls of their child exploring its limited world. Those moments sitting together with their hands on the swell of her stomach became sacred time. They talked about names, about what kind of parents they wanted to be, about how to modify the cabin to accommodate a child who'd grow up with a mother who couldn't chase after them on foot. We'll make it work, became Abigail's constant refrain. Other people have raised children with limitations. We'll figure out our own way. Martha helped prepare baby clothes, teaching Abigail to sew the tiny garments while sharing wisdom from raising her own sons. The small collection of gowns and blankets grew throughout the summer, each piece a tangible promise of the future they were building. But as Abigail's due date approached, tension crept back into their daily lives. Dr. Walsh's monthly visits became weekly, then twice weekly, as September arrived. He brought a midwife, Mrs. Harriet Chen, who'd assisted at difficult births and had a reputation for calm competence in crisis situations. Together, they prepared the cabin for the delivery, discussing positions and techniques that might work given Abigail's unique circumstances. The important thing, Mrs. Chen explained in her no-nonsense way, is that we don't panic. Labor may take longer since you can't feel the contractions properly. Mrs. Callahan, we'll have to watch for other signs, the tightening of your belly, the baby's position, the timing between contractions. And when it's time to push, we'll guide you through it. Your upper body is strong. We'll use that. The first signs of labor came on a Tuesday morning in early September, exactly 7 days before Dr. Walsh's predicted date. Abigail woke to find her nightgown damp and realized her water had broken during the night. She touched Luke's shoulder, her voice remarkably calm. It's time. The baby's coming. Luke bolted upright, instantly awake and already moving. I'll get the doctor, and Mrs. Chen, and Martha. You stay right here. Luke? Abigail caught his hand. Breathe. We have time. First babies take hours usually. Help me get cleaned up and into a fresh gown, then go get whoever you need to get. But don't panic. Our baby is coming, and that's a good thing. Her calmness steadied him, and he moved through the necessary preparations with forced composure. By the time he'd helped her change and settled her comfortably, the first contraction hit, or rather, he saw it hit, watching her belly tighten and harden even though she couldn't feel it. That's one, he said, noting the time. I'm going for help now. Will you be all right alone for an hour? I'll be fine. Go. Quickly, but safely. Our child will wait for their father. Luke rode harder than he'd ridden since his cavalry days, reaching town in record time. Dr. Walsh and Mrs. Chen were alerted and promised to follow immediately. Martha Cole, bless her practical soul, was already packing supplies before Luke finished explaining. Within 2 hours of that first contraction, the cabin was full of capable people, preparing to bring new life into the world. What followed was the longest day of Luke Callahan's life. Labor progressed slowly, as Mrs. Chen had predicted, with contractions that Abigail couldn't feel building in intensity and frequency. They timed them by the visible tightening of her abdomen, by the baby's increasingly urgent movements, by every sign except the pain that should have accompanied them. Abigail remained remarkably calm throughout, breathing through contractions she couldn't feel, by trusting the others to tell her when they peaked. But as afternoon stretched toward evening and the baby showed no signs of arriving, exhaustion began to show in the lines around her eyes. I can't push, she said, finally, frustration breaking through her composure. I know you keep telling me when to bear down, but I can't feel anything. I don't know if I'm doing it right. You're doing fine, Dr. Walsh assured her, though his forehead was creased with concern. The baby's descended appropriately. We just need to be patient. But patience wore thin as evening became night. Abigail was tiring visibly, her upper body strength flagging after hours of attempted pushing. Luke sat beside her, holding her hand and offering what encouragement he could, but fear gnawed at his gut. This was taking too long. Something was wrong. Mrs. Chen seemed to sense his thoughts. She drew Dr. Walsh aside, and Luke heard them conferring in urgent whispers. When they returned, the midwife's face was set with determination. Mrs. Callahan, we're going to try something different. Your upper body is strong from all the work you do with the chair. We're going to use that strength. When the next contraction comes, I want you to curl forward and use your abdominal muscles, the ones you can still control, to push. And Mr. Callahan, you're going to support her back and help her maintain position. Understand? They both nodded, and when the next contraction came, they tried the new technique. Luke braced Abigail from behind while she curled forward, with all her strength bearing down with muscles that had learned to compensate for the ones that no longer worked. Once, twice, 3 times they repeated the motion, and then Mrs. Chen's face lit up with triumph. I see the head. Keep going just like that. 4 more contractions, 4 more coordinated pushes, and then suddenly there was a wail, thin and reedy, and the most beautiful sound Luke had ever heard. He looked over Abigail's shoulder and saw Mrs. Chen holding a tiny, squirming infant, impossibly small and impossibly perfect. A girl, the midwife announced, her stern face breaking into a broad smile. You have a daughter, and she's got excellent lungs. Abigail collapsed back against Luke, tears streaming down her face. Is she all right? All her parts. Is she? She's perfect, Doctor. Walsh confirmed, completing his examination. 10 fingers, 10 toes, good color, responsive. Mrs. Callahan, you did it. We did it, Abigail corrected, reaching back to touch Luke's face. We did it together. Mrs. Chen cleaned the baby efficiently and wrapped her in one of the gowns Abigail had sewn, then placed the bundle carefully in her mother's arms. Luke leaned around to see his daughter's face, wrinkled and red and absolutely beautiful. The baby's eyes squinted in the lamplight, and her tiny fist waved in apparent irritation at being removed from her warm home. Hello, little one, Abigail whispered. Welcome to the world. We're your parents, and we've been waiting for you. Luke couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. He wrapped his arms around both his wife and daughter, overcome with gratitude and wonder and a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. They'd done it. Against all odds and despite all complications, they'd brought this tiny, perfect human into existence. "What will you name her?" Martha asked softly from where she stood near the door, giving them privacy but unable to completely hide her own tears. Abigail and Luke exchanged glances. They'd discussed names endlessly over the past months, but suddenly those conversations seemed distant and unimportant. Looking at their daughter's face, only one name felt right. "Grace," Abigail said. "Her name is Grace, because that's what she is undeserved blessing we received anyway." "Grace Callahan," Luke added, testing how it sounded. "Welcome home, Gracie." The baby chose that moment to root against Abigail's chest, seeking food with newborn instinct. With Mrs. Chen's guidance, Abigail managed to nurse despite her awkward position, and Luke watched in amazement as his daughter latched on and began to feed. Life continuing. Life beginning. Life triumphant over every obstacle that had tried to prevent it. Dr. Walsh and Mrs. Chen stayed through the night, monitoring both mother and baby for any complications. But both seemed to be thriving. Grace nursing well, Abigail recovering as well as could be expected from the marathon of labor. By morning, when the doctor and midwife finally left with promises to check in daily for the first week, the cabin had settled into the strange new rhythm of life with an infant. Grace proved to be a vocal baby, announcing her needs with impressive volume. But Abigail and Luke learned quickly how to interpret her cries, how to soothe her, how to change the tiny nappies and manage the endless cycle of feeding and sleeping. The wheeled chair, which some might have seen as an insurmountable obstacle to motherhood, became instead a portable cradle when Grace was small enough to sleep on Abigail's lap. The modifications they'd made to the cabin proved invaluable. The lowered surfaces meant Abigail could prepare bottles and manage baby care without help. The widened doorways let her wheel from room to room with Grace in her arms. And Luke's continued carpentry, a low crib positioned beside their bed, a changing table at chair height, cushioned flooring. In case Grace rolled off, something created an environment where Abigail could mother effectively despite her limitations. "You're not broken," Luke said one afternoon, finding Abigail nursing Grace on the porch while watching the autumn clouds build. "You never were." Abigail looked up at him, Grace's small hand wrapped around her finger while the baby fed. "No," she agreed softly. "I never was. I just needed someone to see past what I couldn't do to what I could." Luke crouched beside the chair, his hand gentle on his daughter's head. Grace had a surprising amount of dark hair, and her eyes, when she opened them, were beginning to show hints of gray like her mother's. She was perfect. They were perfect. This life they'd built from broken pieces and desperate choices was more than either of them had dared to hope for. "I love you," Luke said simply. "Both of you. More than I have words for." "I love you too." Abigail's free hand found his. "Thank you for seeing me, for giving me the chance to become this person, wife, mother, partner. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for not giving up on yourself, for jumping off that horse instead of surrendering, for choosing life even when it looked impossible." He kissed her hand, then Grace's head. "You're the bravest person I know, Abigail Callahan." They sat together as the afternoon light turned golden, watching their daughter nurse and their land stretch out toward distant mountains. Behind them, the cabin door bore a new sign Luke had carved and hung just that morning. 2 words simple and profound. Callahan Ranch. Not Luke's ranch, not Abigail's refuge, but theirs. Built together from dust and defiance, from love and determination, from the refusal to let other people's expectations define what was possible. Marcus Dugan never came back. Word filtered through town that he'd left the territory entirely chasing political opportunities elsewhere. Whether he'd heard about his granddaughter's birth and chose not to acknowledge it, or whether he simply didn't care, no one could say. Abigail found she didn't mind. Grace would grow up knowing she was wanted, chosen, celebrated. That was more than enough. As winter approached and Grace grew from a newborn into an infant with distinct personality, stubborn like her mother, thoughtful like her father, Luke and Abigail fell into the comfortable rhythms of family life. There were hard days, certainly. Nights when Grace wouldn't stop crying, and they took turns walking the floor with her. Moments when Abigail's limitations frustrated her when she wished she could simply stand and pace with her fussy baby. Times when the ranch demanded more than they seemed able to give. But there were more good days than hard ones. Mornings when they'd wake to find Grace smiling toothlessly between them. Afternoons working side by side in the garden while Grace napped in a basket nearby. Evenings sitting together watching the sunset while their daughter discovered her own toes with infinite fascination. The ranch continued to prosper under their partnership. With Abigail's financial management and Luke's skill with horses, they expanded slowly but steadily. They hired help when they needed it, paid fair wages, and earned a reputation for honest dealing. The whispers about the paralyzed wife and the hermit husband faded, replaced by respect for the Callahans, that couple who'd built something solid from unpromising beginnings. On a cool November afternoon, nearly a year after Sheriff Dugan's confrontation, Abigail sat on the porch with Grace propped on her lap. The baby was trying to grab falling leaves, laughing with delight each time one drifted past. Luke was working in the corral, training a young mare, and Abigail watched him move with the easy confidence of a man at peace with himself. Martha Cole rode up as she did most weeks, bringing fresh bread and gossip from town. She dismounted and climbed the porch steps, pausing to tickle Grace's chin before settling into the chair Luke had built specifically for visitors. "You look content," Martha observed. "I am content." Abigail shifted Grace to a more secure position. More than content. Happy. Complete in a way I never expected to feel. "It shows," Martha smiled. "The whole town talks about it, you know. How the Callahans went from tragedy and loneliness to this," she gestured at the scene before them, "to family and purpose and love. We're lucky. You're brave. There's a difference." Martha's eyes grew serious. "Not many women could have done what you did. Choosing to break your own body rather than surrender your freedom. Choosing to trust a stranger when your own father failed you. Choosing to build this life when it would have been easier to give up. That's not luck, Abigail. That's courage." Abigail looked down at Grace, who'd abandoned leaf catching to gum her mother's finger with intense concentration. "I didn't feel brave. I just felt desperate. And then I felt like I didn't have any other choice but to keep going forward." That's what courage is, though. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Martha reached over to squeeze Abigail's shoulder. "You've built something remarkable here. A home, a family, a life that's entirely your own. That's worth celebrating." As if on cue, Luke finished with the mare and headed toward the house, his eyes going immediately to his wife and daughter on the porch. The smile that transformed his weathered face was one Abigail never tired of seeing, pure joy mixed with wonder that this was his life now. "How are my girls?" he asked, climbing the steps. "Perfect," Abigail replied, holding up Grace so Luke could take her. The baby gurgled happily, recognizing her father, and Luke cradled her with the careful tenderness of a man who'd learned to handle something infinitely precious. "She's getting so big," Martha marveled. "What is she now? Almost 3 months. Tutsi, 3 months next week." Luke bounced Grace gently. "And already trying to roll over. She's going to be mobile before we know it." "Then you'd better child-proof that cabin," Martha laughed. "Curious babies get into everything." They talked about mundane things, the upcoming winter plans for next year's Planting Town news, that was interesting without being vital. But underneath the conversation ran a current of contentment, of people who'd found their place in the world and were grateful for it. As the afternoon wore toward evening and Martha prepared to leave, she paused on the porch steps and looked back at the Callahans, Luke standing behind Abigail's chair, with Grace in his arms, the three of them framed by the golden light of the setting sun. It was a picture of family, of love of life, continuing despite every obstacle that had tried to prevent it. "You know," Martha said thoughtfully, "when your father dumped you here 6 months ago, half the town thought you'd be dead or institutionalized within a year. They thought Luke was a fool for taking you in and that you were too damaged to survive." Abigail raised her chin, that familiar spark of defiance lighting her eyes. "And now they see the truth. You weren't damaged. You were dangerous. Dangerous to every lie your father told about what makes a person valuable. Dangerous to everyone who thinks walking defines worth. Dangerous to all the small minds who couldn't imagine a life different from their own." Martha smiled. "You're dangerous, Abigail Callahan, and the world's better for it." After Martha left, Luke and Abigail stayed on the porch as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and indigo. Grace had fallen asleep against her father's shoulder, her tiny fist curled against his chest, and both parents were reluctant to move and disturb her peace. "Do you ever regret it?" Abigail asked quietly. "Taking me in that day, your life would be simpler without me." Luke looked at her with such love and exasperation that she almost laughed. "My life was empty without you. Simple, maybe, but empty. Now it's complicated and messy and challenging and more full than I ever imagined it could be. No, Abigail, I don't regret a single moment. Not even when I'm frustrated and snapping at you because I can't reach something. Not even then. Not even when the whole town was talking about us. Especially not then. Let them talk. They'll never understand what we have." Abigail wheeled closer so she could lean against his legs, looking up at him and their sleeping daughter. "What do we have, Luke? Everything that matters. Love, partnership, a child, a home we built together, a future that's ours to shape." He shifted Grace to one arm so he could reach down and touch Abigail's face. "We have what your father could never understand, the knowledge that a person's worth isn't measured by their body's abilities, but by their heart's capacity. You have more heart than anyone I've ever known. So do you." She caught his hand and pressed it to her cheek. "You gave me back my life, Luke Callahan. Know it, you gave me a better life than I'd ever had. One where I matter not because of what I can do for someone else, but because of who I am. You always mattered, I just helped you see it." They stayed like that as stars began to appear overhead, the three of them together on the porch of their home. Inside the cabin waited warm and secure, modified and adapted to meet their needs, filled with evidence of the life they were building together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments to navigate as a family. But tonight, they had this peace love, and the profound satisfaction of knowing they'd chosen each other and created something beautiful from unpromising beginnings. Grace stirred in Luke's arms, making the small snuffling sounds that preceded waking. Abigail smiled, recognizing the signs that their daughter would soon demand attention. "Time to go in," she said. "She'll want to nurse, and you'll want your supper." "In a minute." Luke bent to kiss the top of Abigail's head. "I just want to remember this moment. The three of us together watching the stars come out over our land. This is what happiness looks like." Abigail reached up to squeeze his hand. "Then let's have a lifetime of moments like this." "Deal." As they moved inside, Luke carrying Grace Abigail wheeling beside him, the wind picked up, cool and sweet with the promise of desert winter. It rustled through the garden they'd planted together, whispered through the modified cabin they'd created together, and settled over the ranch they were building together. The Callahan Ranch. Not a place of survival, but a place of thriving. Not a shelter from the world, but a home built to meet the world on their own terms. And at its heart, two people who'd been broken and abandoned and dismissed, now made whole through the simple revolutionary act of choosing each other. Behind them, the door closed against the night. Inside, lamplight glowed warm through the windows. And the story that had begun with cruelty and rejection, with a father's callous abandonment and a daughter's desperate choice, continued forward into a future bright with possibility. They were the Callahans, Luke and Abigail and Grace, and they were exactly where they belonged.